It was a night unlike any other, one that would be whispered about in hushed tones for centuries, yet whose true events remained obscured by shadow and secrecy. In the deepest chambers of a grand European palace, torches flickered against cold stone walls, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was heavy with the scent of wax, iron, and something darker, something that hinted at the gravity of what was about to unfold. Monarchs, draped in velvet and adorned with jewels that glittered even in the dim torchlight, moved with a solemnity that betrayed an unspoken fear. They were not kings and queens as their subjects knew them, but participants in a ritual older than any living memory, bound by promises that stretched beyond life itself. A hush fell over the room as a figure stepped forward, the leader of this clandestine assembly, holding a ceremonial dagger whose blade reflected the trembling light like liquid silver. The monarchs watched, hearts beating in a rhythm dictated not by joy or anticipation, but by the weight of what they were about to commit themselves to. One by one, they were asked to extend their hands, and as a drop of blood fell onto the ceremonial parchment, it mingled with the inked signatures of their predecessors. The sound was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in that silence, the room seemed to vibrate with a warning. This was no ordinary oath, no mere political alliance. This was a bond that demanded absolute loyalty, demanding the surrender of secrets, conscience, and perhaps even morality itself. Outside, the night carried no ordinary sounds. The wind howled through empty courtyards, brushing against towering spires and sending faint echoes through deserted halls. Servants and guards had been long dismissed, the doors sealed, ensuring that no prying eyes could witness what history was about to bury. The weight of centuries pressed down on this small, hidden gathering, a reminder that every choice made here would ripple through generations. Every drop of blood spilled in that room was a silent testament to fear, to ambition, and to a desperate hope that some hidden power, some invisible hand, would preserve the sanctity of their rule. Yet, even in their solemnity, tension coiled like a living thing around the monarchs. There were glances exchanged, brief flashes of doubt and fear. Some wondered if their loyalty would survive the years, if betrayals might creep into their own lineages, poisoning the carefully constructed edifice of allegiance. Others steeled themselves, eyes fixed on the ritual, willing themselves to silence any whisper of conscience. There was no room for hesitation, no allowance for error. The pact demanded absolute obedience. And in that very demand lay its terrifying power. To break the oath was unthinkable, not only because of the wrath it might invoke, but because of the unknown consequences whispered about in rumors and threats that had been passed down through secret networks of courtiers and advisors. The ritual continued, each gesture deliberate, each word spoken in low, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate against the walls themselves. Every motion, every syllable, was designed to bind them not only to one another, but to the invisible forces that had guided the course of Europe long before their reigns. The monarchs knew that the eyes of history, though unseen, were watching, and that the judgments of those who came after them could be merciless. But it was not just the eyes of history they feared. It was the eyes of the pact itself, an unseen presence that would hold them accountable in ways both subtle and devastating. By the time the ceremony reached its conclusion, a profound silence had settled over the chamber. The kings and queens stood, bound together by more than oath or ambition, a connection sealed in blood and shadow. A sense of foreboding lingered, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for a whisper of betrayal to shatter the fragile balance. And as they departed, stepping back into the corridors of power and privilege. Each monarch carried with him a secret that could never be spoken aloud, a knowledge that would shape not only their own destiny, but the destiny of Europe itself. Even centuries later, historians would stumble upon faint clues, fragments of letters, cryptic diaries, and mysterious symbols that hinted at what had occurred that night. Yet no record would fully capture the terror, the reverence, and the awe that the participants must have felt as they sealed their fates in that hidden chamber. And so the secret endured, passed down in whispers, in gestures, and in the quiet complicity of those who understood that some truths were too dangerous to ever reveal. What drove these rulers to such extremes? Was it fear of the unknown, the lust for power, or the desire to preserve their families above all else? And what dark legacy did their obedience leave for the generations that followed? These questions would haunt Europe, shaping history in ways that are only now beginning to be understood. As the echoes of that night reverberate through time, one thought lingers, chilling and undeniable. Some secrets are too potent to remain buried, yet too perilous to ever be revealed. The blood pact did not appear out of thin air. It was forged in the crucible of fear, ambition, and desperation. To understand its origins, one must travel back to a Europe divided by kingdoms, empires, and endless intrigue. Wars raged across continents, and monarchs who sat upon gilded thrones understood that power alone could not secure their reigns. Diplomacy was fragile, alliances were fleeting, and betrayal lurked in every courtly smile. In this volatile landscape, whispers began to emerge about a secret bond, an unspoken understanding that could protect rulers from the chaos surrounding them. It was said that the first such oaths were made in hidden chapels and abandoned monasteries, far from the eyes of the public and the church, places where the faint light of candles barely touched the darkness. The earliest records are frustratingly vague. Letters survive only in fragments, references buried in the margins of treaties, and cryptic notations in diaries that have puzzled scholars for centuries. Yet, within these traces, a pattern emerges. Rulers seeking certainty in a world where uncertainty reigned supreme. They began to bind themselves through rituals that were as chilling as they were sacred. Blood was the medium, an irrevocable mark of devotion and compliance. Each drop spilled symbolized not just loyalty to the crown, but a submission to forces unseen and, perhaps, unimaginable. The ritual was not merely symbolic. It carried a weight of expectation and consequence, as if the very act of participation tethered their souls to a fate beyond comprehension. What drove these rulers to such extreme measures? Some historians argue it was the pursuit of unity, a desperate attempt to prevent endless war by binding the continent's most powerful families together. Others hint at darker motivations, a compulsion to control destiny itself, to harness hidden powers through secret rites that blurred the line between the earthly and the supernatural. The rituals varied from one kingdom to another. In some, candles were arranged in precise geometric patterns, and symbols carved into the floors, their meanings long forgotten but their effects feared. In others, the monarchs swore oaths over relics and artifacts, believing that these objects carried the essence of authority and divine favor. And always at the heart of it was blood, a living testament that this was not merely an agreement, but a covenant with stakes far higher than any treaty or law. Evidence suggests that the early blood pacts were enforced by advisors who walked a thin line between religious authority and occult knowledge. Some were priests, others scholars of forbidden texts, and a few were masters of esoteric practices. Their guidance ensured that the rituals were performed correctly and that the sacred secrecy remained unbroken. To these men, failure was unthinkable. A misstep could bring disaster not just upon the monarchs, but upon the very kingdoms they governed. Their meticulous records, often written in coded language or hidden within innocuous-looking manuscripts, hint at ceremonies that lasted hours, if not days, with participants driven to exhaustion and trembling under the weight of obligation. And yet, the human element could not be ignored. Even kings and queens, surrounded by power and wealth, were not immune to fear and doubt. Diaries reveal moments of hesitation, fleeting thoughts of betrayal, and even terror at the consequences of their own choices. One such note, discovered centuries later, spoke of a queen who wept before the ritual, afraid of what her compliance would demand of her children and successors. Another spoke of a king who could not sleep for nights, haunted by the notion that one false word or gesture might unravel not only his life, but the security of the pact itself. The emotional stakes were immense. Loyalty was not optional, and defiance was unthinkable. Twist enters here. Evidence suggests that the pact was not always agreed upon freely. In some cases, monarchs were pressured, coerced, or blackmailed into joining, the details of their induction shrouded in rumor and fear. Some sources hint at threats made against their heirs, mysterious deaths that served as grim reminders of what disobedience could cost. The ritual, ostensibly a symbol of unity and trust, had layers of manipulation that ensured compliance. By binding rulers together in secrecy, the architects of the pact created a system of mutual accountability and mutual terror. Every participant knew that betrayal, even decades later, could bring swift and untraceable consequences. Despite the shadowy nature of the blood pact, its influence became undeniable. Over generations, it shaped alliances, marriages, and wars in ways that ordinary records barely acknowledge. Historians are beginning to see patterns in political upheavals, sudden deaths, and inexplicable decisions that point toward the unseen hand of the pact. For example, some royal marriages that appeared purely strategic now seem to have served a more secret purpose, binding bloodlines and ensuring that the obligations of the pact could not be avoided. Entire families, once rivals, were forced into cooperation under the silent, unbreakable weight of an oath whose terms were never written in law, but enforced by fear and devotion alike. Yet the most chilling aspect of the early blood pacts may be the deliberate suppression of evidence. Every attempt to record the ceremonies publicly was met with destruction, subtle threats, or the erasure of witnesses. Manuscripts were burned, letters vanished, and chroniclers who strayed too close to the truth often met untimely deaths. It is a testament to the Pact's power that its very existence was largely hidden, known only to those sworn to secrecy, and yet its impact resonates through the decisions and destinies of Europe's ruling families for centuries. By the end of the first century of its practice, the Blood Pact had evolved into something more than an agreement among rulers. It became a living force, shaping not just politics, but the psychology of those bound by it. Kings and queens were haunted by an invisible obligation, one that demanded vigilance, cunning, and above all, obedience. The pact was a shadow over their crowns, a reminder that power came not without cost, and that loyalty, true loyalty, required sacrifices that no one outside the circle could imagine. And so, as the centuries unfolded, the blood pact endured, quietly guiding the destinies of rulers who believed themselves free, yet were forever bound. Its origins, steeped in fear, ambition, and a desire to control fate, left traces that historians now struggle to piece together. Each clue, each fragmentary record, suggests a level of coordination and secrecy that is almost impossible to fathom. And for those who would uncover it today, the mystery is only beginning to reveal its breadth, its depth, and the unnerving truth that some of history's greatest decisions were made not in the light of day, but in shadowed rooms where blood sealed fates that ordinary people would never comprehend. The first betrayal of the Blood Pact is shrouded in shadows, known only through fragments of letters and rumors that survive the careful erasure of history. It occurred not long after the initial oaths had been sworn, when the weight of secrecy and the allure of unbound power collided. One monarch, young and ambitious, began to question the necessity of the ritual. Perhaps it was hubris, or perhaps a desperate desire to assert independence. But in defying the pact, this ruler would unleash consequences far beyond comprehension. What began as subtle disregard for the rules soon escalated into actions that left the court and the kingdom reeling. Advisors whispered of ominous signs, mirrors that cracked inexplicably, candles extinguished by invisible hands, and shadows that moved where no one was present. The betrayal was not only political, it was deeply personal. Those who had sworn loyalty to the pact found themselves torn between their vows and the human desire for autonomy. Some struggled with conscience, questioning whether the consequences promised by the pact were real or merely superstition. Others acted with cold pragmatism, enforcing the unseen rules of a covenant none of them fully understood. Yet even those most resolute felt unease. Letters describe nights of sleepless terror, of waking to strange noises in empty corridors, or sensing unseen eyes tracking every move. The weight of expectation had shifted into a palpable dread. The pact was no longer a distant ceremony, but a living force exacting its will. Then came the deaths. A series of sudden, inexplicable demises struck the inner circle of the monarch's court. Noble advisors vanished without explanation. Soldiers fell ill with mysterious fevers. A trusted sibling succumbed to a sudden, violent accident. Chroniclers of the time, if they dared to record such events, wrote in euphemisms and riddles, hinting at curses, divine retribution, or the wrath of hidden powers. The pattern was undeniable. The blood pact had been breached, and its response was swift, merciless, and precise. Those who might have spoken out about the betrayal either disappeared or were silenced by threats that left no trace, leaving behind only whispers and fear. What makes this betrayal especially compelling is the human drama entwined with it. The monarch at the center of the defiance was not evil, merely flawed in ways that highlight the terrifying human cost of absolute secrecy. Letters discovered centuries later reveal inner torment, fear of death, guilt for what the defiance had unleashed upon innocent courtiers, and the dread of an unknown force bound to the covenant. There were moments of faint hope, brief attempts to reconcile, and desperate attempts to perform atonement rituals. Yet history records that these gestures were insufficient. The pact demanded absolute obedience, and the consequences could not be undone. Twist. The betrayal had a ripple effect beyond the court. Neighboring kingdoms, unaware of the pact, interpreted the sudden chaos as political weakness, launching invasions or manipulating marriages to exploit the instability. In truth, the real cause remained hidden behind layers of secrecy, its true nature known only to the initiated. It is a chilling reminder that the blood pact, though invisible to the public eye, exerted influence far beyond the walls of any single palace, shaping geopolitics in ways that ordinary historians would later struggle to explain. Historians today speculate on the psychological effects of the betrayal as well. Participants in the pact, witnessing the consequences of defiance, reportedly grew more cautious, more paranoid, and more willing to enforce secrecy through manipulation and fear. The young monarch, once a figure of promise, became a shadow of former ambition, haunted by the realization that the Pact's authority was not merely ceremonial, but a living, sentient force capable of exacting punishment with terrifying precision. The betrayal also created an undercurrent of mistrust among the kingdoms involved. Even allies questioned loyalty, unsure who might act against the Pact or manipulate its rules for personal gain. Account from the time suggests that the breach of the Pact left permanent scars on the royal family. Some members withdrew from public life, consumed by guilt or fear. Others became ruthless enforcers of loyalty, ensuring that the blood oath would never again be broken. Letters hint at coded warnings sent to other rulers, subtle threats masked as diplomacy, ensuring compliance without public scandal. These communications reveal the ingenuity with which the Pact was maintained. Secrecy combined with psychological manipulation, creating a system where obedience became not just expected, but instinctive. Yet, in the shadows of this betrayal, a more unsettling pattern emerges. Some contemporaneous chronicles hint that the Pact's influence may have extended into dreams, nightmares, and visions. The monarchs involved reported seeing faces in the dark, hearing whispers in empty halls, and feeling presences that no one else could perceive. Scholars have debated whether these were manifestations of guilt and fear or evidence that the Pact held a power beyond the physical world. What is undeniable, however, is the effect on decision-making. Rulers became cautious to an extreme. Their strategies, alliances, and even personal relationships shaped by a silent, ever-present dread. The first betrayal set a precedent that would echo for centuries. It proved that the blood pact was not a static agreement, but a dynamic force capable of enforcing itself through both human and unknown means. It also demonstrated that no ruler, regardless of ambition or strength, could escape its influence. From this point onward, the fear of breach, the pressure to comply, and the awareness of unseen consequences became central to the conduct of European monarchs. Their actions, marriages, alliances, and even wars were increasingly guided by the invisible hand of the blood oath, shaping history in ways that would only be fully understood generations later. And so, the first betrayal became a legend, whispered among the initiated, studied by scholars, and feared by rulers who understood its implications. It was a moment when history, superstition, and human ambition collided, producing outcomes that were both horrifying and inescapable. The blood pact had proven itself, absolute in its demand, inscrutable in its logic, and unyielding in its consequences. The monarchs who witnessed it and survived emerged changed, their eyes wider, their trust narrower, and their understanding of power forever altered. As the night drew to a close, the consequences of that betrayal stretched far beyond the palace walls. The monarch's defiance was not just a personal failing, but a lesson imprinted on every generation that followed. That loyalty is a fragile thing, and that the price of secrecy is often measured in human lives, fear, and unimaginable psychological weight. The first breach would be remembered not only as an act of defiance, but as the moment when the blood pact revealed its true, terrifying power, a force that would silently guide Europe for centuries, shaping destinies in ways the world was only beginning to comprehend. Beneath the gilded halls and ornate chambers of Europe's palaces lay another world, one unseen by courtiers, diplomats, and commoners alike. Hidden corridors, forgotten stairwells, and subterranean chambers stretched like veins beneath the kingdoms, connecting rooms where decisions of unimaginable consequence were made. These secret places were not mere architectural quirks. They were deliberate constructions designed to conceal, protect, and in some cases terrify. The very stones seemed to absorb whispers and footsteps, holding centuries of secrets within their cold, unyielding walls. It is here, in the hidden heart of the palace, that the Blood Pact found its most enduring sanctuary. The corridors themselves were enigmatic, some twisted in labyrinthine complexity, so that even the most experienced servants could not navigate them without guidance. Others were concealed behind false walls, sliding panels, or heavy tapestries, their existence known only to the initiated. In these passages, shadows moved independently of their sources, and the flicker of candlelight often revealed glimpses of symbols etched in a stone or carved into wood, signs of allegiance, warnings, or cryptic instructions. To traverse these hidden spaces was to step into a world where time and power operated differently, where the ordinary rules of courtly life no longer applied. Within the subterranean chambers, the Blood Pact was enacted in its most intimate and terrifying forms. Kings and queens, stripped of the ceremonial trappings of their public roles, engaged in rituals that required absolute trust, unwavering focus, and unquestioning obedience. Candles were arranged in precise patterns, sometimes forming circles, other times intricate sigils whose meanings were known only to those sworn to secrecy. The air was thick with the scent of wax, herbs, and occasionally the copper tang of blood itself. Every movement, every word spoken, carried significance, a combination of devotion, fear, and calculated intention that bound participants together beyond mere promise. But these chambers were not only sites of ritual, they were instruments of control. Advisors and occult practitioners who understood the Pact's mechanics could manipulate environments to enforce obedience. Flickering torches, hidden mirrors, or carved symbols could induce fear or awe, shaping behavior and reinforcing loyalty. Monarchs, no matter how powerful, were subtly reminded that the Pact was ever present, its influence invisible but undeniable. The architecture itself became a participant, silently guiding, warning, and punishing, leaving rulers to navigate both the physical labyrinth and the moral maze of their obligations. Twist. Some chambers contained mechanisms designed to erase evidence of disobedience. Floors could collapse, walls could seal shut, or secret passages could trap the unwary. Diaries and letters hint at courtiers who ventured too far into forbidden areas, never to return, their absence attributed publicly to illness or accident. These spaces were not just shelters for rituals. They were instruments of fear, carefully engineered to maintain the Pact's authority through subtle terror. It was a constant reminder that breaking the oath, or even questioning it too loudly, carried consequences as real as the stone walls that enclosed them. The chambers also preserved the Pact across generations. Symbols and inscriptions were carefully updated by those initiated into the secret, ensuring that each successive monarch understood the rituals and their stakes. Some chambers contained hidden alcoves where manuscripts and codices were stored, chronicling the ceremonies, rules, and consequences for violation. These documents were deliberately obscure, written in code, symbolism, or language that only the trained could decipher. Even when discovered centuries later, their meaning remained tantalizingly elusive, offering clues but never full understanding. Within these hidden spaces, the emotional intensity was palpable. Monarchs experienced a combination of awe, terror, and reverence. Letters and memoirs, often encoded or hidden, describe the sensations of standing in these chambers, a sense of being watched, a suffocating pressure of obligation, and a fear that a single misstep could undo not just their lives, but the stability of entire kingdoms. One chronicler, writing decades later, described feeling as though the very stones bore judgment, an ever-present reminder of the cost of power and secrecy. The human element of the pact, loyalty, fear, and psychological manipulation, was as important as the ceremonial acts themselves. Twist. Some historians suggest that the chambers were more than physical spaces. They were also symbolic representations of power. By concealing the most dangerous knowledge and ritual in underground labyrinths, the architects of the pact reinforced the separation between public authority and hidden control. Monarchs could rule openly in grand halls, but their obedience to the blood pact remained an invisible tether, a silent hand guiding decisions, shaping alliances, and orchestrating betrayals with terrifying precision. The pact, then, was not only a covenant. It was architecture, psychology, and ritual intertwined into a force that could not be challenged openly. The influence of these hidden spaces extended beyond ritual. They shaped courtly life, influencing who was trusted, who was excluded, and who was deemed necessary for maintaining the secrecy. Advisors who understood the chamber's full design wielded power that rivaled or even exceeded the monarchs themselves. Courtiers learned quickly that survival depended not only on skill and favor, but also on understanding the hidden rules, symbols, and signals embedded within the palace. A misstep could result in exile, disgrace, or worse, disappearance without explanation, a fate that left the public none the wiser but those within the circle trembling with fear. Over centuries, some of these chambers fell into disuse or were deliberately concealed, their existence fading into legend. Yet traces remain, hidden behind walls, beneath floors, and within ancient maps of palace architecture. Modern explorations have revealed stairways that lead nowhere, rooms whose entrances are nearly impossible to find, and inscriptions that hint at rituals long forgotten. Each discovery rekindles fascination and fear, offering a glimpse into a world where loyalty was enforced not just by law, but by terror, ritual, and the very design of space itself. The hidden chambers of Europe's palaces are more than relics of architectural ingenuity. They're the silent keepers of a centuries-old secret. They hold the echoes of whispered oaths, the imprints of blood rituals, and a lingering presence of monarchs who understood that true power demanded submission not only to law, but to a covenant beyond comprehension. Walking through them, one senses the invisible threads that bind past to present, rulers to rituals, and human ambition to forces beyond sight. In these shadows, the blood pact thrives, eternal and unyielding, a reminder that some secrets are as much about where they are hidden as about what they contain. The blood pact was never meant to be a fleeting agreement. Its architects understood that power, no matter how vast, was fragile, and that allegiance without consequence was meaningless. From the earliest ceremonies, the pact was designed to transcend individual lifetimes, binding entire bloodlines to its unseen will. Monarchs were not merely participants. They were custodians, responsible for passing the oath to their heirs, ensuring that loyalty, fear, and secrecy persisted across generations. The pact was hereditary, a shadow inheritance that accompanied every crown, whispering its demands in the ears of princes and princesses long before they understood the weight they bore. This hereditary nature of the pact transformed the very concept of monarchy. Rulers became more than leaders. They were vessels for a covenant older than the dynasties themselves. Instructions were encoded in letters, taught in private lessons, or whispered in corridors where servants dared not tread. Children born into these families were educated not just in matters of governance, but in the responsibilities of secrecy, the rituals that must be upheld, and the consequences that awaited even the faintest deviation. As a result, loyalty was ingrained early, almost instinctively, and the fear of failing the pact became a central pillar of royal upbringing. Yet the human element was never absent. Even as heirs were trained to accept their roles within the covenant, doubts and curiosity festered. Some young royals questioned the morality of the rituals, the necessity of such secrecy, or the stories of punishment whispered in the halls. Diaries and marginal notes, discovered centuries later, hint at clandestine confessions. A prince writing of sleepless nights, a princess secretly hiding letters describing strange visions or nightmares. The pact demanded absolute obedience, yet it could not extinguish the spark of individuality, leaving heirs caught between instinctive loyalty and human conscience. Twist: the pact also created internal conflict within families. Rivalries and tensions were heightened, as members measured not only ambition and political skill, but also adherence to the covenant. In some cases, younger siblings deliberately avoided certain knowledge or rituals, fearing the consequences of failure. Others embraced the full weight of the obligation, becoming enforcers of tradition and secrecy within their own households. The emotional stakes were immense. The pact demanded not only loyalty to kings and queens, but to invisible forces that judged actions beyond human understanding. Family bonds, while outwardly strong, were often tempered by fear, suspicion, and the need to maintain appearances. The consequences of failing to uphold the hereditary bond were severe. Records suggest that those who deviated from the pact, whether by neglect, curiosity, or rebellion, faced punishments that ranged from sudden illness to exile, and in some instances, mysterious deaths. One letter, coded in obscure symbolism, recounts the fate of a young noble who attempted to disclose the existence of the covenant to a foreign ally. Within days, the noble vanished, leaving only faint traces of presence: a blood-stained letter, a half-finished meal, and a palace staff too terrified to speak. The message was clear. The blood pact was eternal, unforgiving, and capable of extending its influence far beyond the immediate circle of participants. The hereditary nature of the pact also influenced political decisions, shaping marriages, alliances, and succession plans. Royal families orchestrated unions not merely for wealth or territory, but to secure the continuation of the covenant and to ensure that heirs remained bound by it. Scholars studying these patterns note coincidences that seem impossible: marriages between distant cousins, unexplained shifts in succession, and sudden removals of heirs from public view. While contemporary accounts often attribute these actions to strategy or necessity, a deeper analysis suggests the guiding hand of the blood pact, ensuring that loyalty and secrecy were preserved above all else. Twist: beyond enforcing loyalty, the hereditary pact acted as a mechanism of control over entire populations. By binding the ruling family together, the covenant indirectly influenced the governance of nations. Policies, wars, and alliances were often subtly guided by the need to maintain secrecy or prevent exposure of the covenant. Historical records hint that some decisions, seemingly made for political or economic reasons, were in fact influenced by the hidden obligations of the blood pact. Entire kingdoms, unknowingly, became part of a system orchestrated in shadow, where the true forces shaping events were hidden from the public eye. The psychological impact on heirs was profound. Letters, diaries, and coded messages suggest that the fear of failing the pact haunted young royals well into adulthood. Dreams were often filled with visions of punishment, ancestral figures admonishing them, or abstract warnings that defied logic. Even as they ascended to power, these rulers carried the weight of centuries of expectation, their every decision informed by an invisible authority. Obedience became second nature, fear a constant companion, and secrecy a defining characteristic of their lives. The Pact transformed ordinary human ambition into something far more complex, a mixture of duty, terror, and inherited responsibility. Yet, despite the fear and manipulation, there were moments of awe and reverence. Some heirs wrote of the solemnity of the rituals, the gravity of swearing an oath that connected them to generations past and future. In these moments, loyalty was intertwined with a sense of destiny, a recognition that they were participants in a covenant greater than themselves. The blood pact, terrifying as it was, also inspired devotion, binding rulers not just to the covenant, but to an almost mystical understanding of their role in history. It was a duality of fear and reverence, a constant tension that shaped the emotional and psychological landscape of European royalty. Over the centuries, the hereditary enforcement of the blood pact ensured its survival even through upheaval, war, and revolution. Monarchs adapted, rituals evolved, and the covenant's influence permeated every aspect of royal life. Those who might have questioned its purpose often found themselves silenced by fear, tradition, or the realization that compliance was the only path to survival. And so, the covenant endured, a shadowy thread weaving through the tapestry of European history, binding rulers across generations with a force as invisible as it was inescapable. The story of bloodlines bound by fear is not merely historical, it is a human story. It illustrates the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to secure power, preserve loyalty, and control destiny. It is a tale of psychological manipulation, inherited obligation, and the interplay of fear and reverence. Through the centuries, it demonstrates that the most enduring forces in history are not always written in law or declared openly in public, but are often preserved in shadows, rituals, and the unyielding obligations of those born into power. And so, as generations of monarchs rose and fell, the blood pact endured, a silent arbiter of fate, ensuring that loyalty was never optional, that fear was a constant companion, and that the weight of secrecy shaped lives in ways the public could scarcely imagine. The covenant was eternal, its influence subtle yet pervasive, and its legacy a chilling reminder that some oaths are more powerful than any throne, more binding than any law, and more terrifying than any known force in the world. Every monarch requires counsel, but in the shadow of the blood pact, advisors became more than guides. They became silent enforcers of a covenant whose rules were hidden from the public eye. These figures were masters of manipulation, scholars of forbidden knowledge, and occasionally, men or women steeped in arcane arts. Their role was not simply to advise on politics, war, or diplomacy, but to ensure that the covenant remained unbroken, that every action of the ruler aligned with obligations few could comprehend. They were the quiet architects of loyalty and fear, a shadow network controlling not just decisions but destinies. The advisors operated in subtle ways. A whispered warning in a corridor, a carefully placed letter, or a seemingly innocuous suggestion at a council meeting could reinforce the pact's invisible authority. Monarchs quickly learned that defiance was not an abstract notion. It could manifest as inexplicable misfortune, illness, or even death. The advisors' knowledge of human psychology, combined with their awareness of the pact's rituals and consequences, created a system where rulers internalized obedience, believing that deviation might unleash forces beyond reason. The advisors' influence was invisible but absolute. Some were priests, leveraging the weight of divine authority to guide compliance. Others were scholars, poring over obscure texts, manuscripts, and prophecies, extracting lessons that could shape behavior subtly yet decisively. A select few were occultists, versed in rituals that the public would have deemed heretical or unthinkable. Their presence created an environment where loyalty was inseparable from fear, and knowledge of the pact was power in itself. To be an advisor was to wield influence greater than any army, for the covenant ensured that rulers acted not just according to political need, but according to an unseen force dictating obedience. Twist: some advisors reportedly manipulated rulers for personal gain, exploiting the fear of the pact to consolidate their own power. Letters and marginalia, discovered centuries later, hint at plots orchestrated not for the kingdom's benefit, but to tighten the grip of those who understood the covenant. Monarchs, while ostensibly the most powerful individuals in Europe, were subtly shaped by those who mastered the intricate web of fear, loyalty, and secrecy. The line between guidance and manipulation blurred, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between a ruler's genuine decision and one dictated by the invisible hand of the pact. The human cost of this manipulation was immense. Monarchs wrote of sleepless nights, paranoia, and a constant sense of being watched, not only by their advisors but by the very force of the covenant itself. The weight of expectation created an emotional landscape dominated by fear and reverence. One king, writing in secret, described feeling as though the walls themselves spoke of duty and consequence, and that any misstep would echo beyond my lifetime. These advisors, aware of the monarch's vulnerability, could enforce compliance without ever revealing the pact's full extent, relying on suggestion, intuition, and the subtle orchestration of circumstance. Twist: some advisors were rumored to possess knowledge of outcomes yet to occur, using prophecy or coded records to predict decisions and influence behavior. In some cases, letters suggest that rulers were presented with scenarios of inevitable doom should they disobey, pushing them toward compliance out of fear that the covenant's consequences were inescapable. This manipulation, subtle yet terrifying, ensured that the blood pact was maintained even when rulers were tempted by personal ambition or rebellion. The advisor became both mentor and enforcer, blending guidance with coercion so seamlessly that monarchs often could not distinguish between their own intentions and the influence of the covenant's custodians. The advisor's influence extended beyond the individual ruler to entire dynasties. By shaping marriages, succession plans, and political alliances, they ensured the hereditary continuation of the pact. Heirs were subtly guided in childhood, educated to respect rituals and traditions that reinforced loyalty. Advisors were the custodians of secrecy, ensuring that knowledge of the covenant remained confined to those bound by it, and that the mistakes of one generation did not compromise the next. In this sense, they were more than counselors. They were the invisible architects of history, subtly steering the course of kingdoms through the prism of fear and devotion. The emotional stakes were profound. Monarchs often found themselves dependent on advisors in ways that went beyond trust or convenience. They became vessels for the pact's enforcement, psychologically bound by fear, guilt, and reverence. Advisors, aware of this dependence, wielded an influence as powerful as any army or treasury, yet without the need for overt force. Their authority lay in subtlety, in the manipulation of perception and the orchestration of circumstance. The psychological mastery of these figures ensured that the covenant endured, shaping the decisions of rulers for centuries without ever being fully seen. The legacy of these shadow advisors can still be traced in historical events. Wars, treaties, and dynastic decisions often appear inexplicable until one considers the silent hand guiding rulers to uphold the pact. Scholars now recognize that political events sometimes align less with public reasoning and more with the hidden imperatives of loyalty, secrecy, and fear enforced by those who understood the covenant. The true power of Europe's monarchs was, in many ways, inseparable from the advisors who shaped their actions behind closed doors. Even centuries later, traces of their influence remain. Hidden notes in archives, marginalia in manuscripts, and cryptic correspondences suggest the presence of a sophisticated network of control that extended across courts and generations. The advisor's work was never purely administrative or ceremonial. It was existential, ensuring that the blood pact remained unbroken, that loyalty endured, and that the human psyche remained aligned with a covenant older than any living ruler. Their mastery was subtle, psychological, and terrifyingly effective, a testament to the enduring power of secrecy and the lengths humans will go to preserve it. In the end, the shadow advisors were more than mentors or manipulators. They were the invisible lifeblood of the blood pact. Without them, the covenant would have unraveled under human ambition, doubt, or curiosity. With them, it became an unstoppable force, shaping European history through fear, loyalty, and psychological mastery. Their influence reminds us that power is never purely visible, and that the most enduring forces in history are often those that operate in silence, guiding rulers, shaping destinies, and enforcing obligations that stretch across centuries. The secrecy of the blood pact extended far beyond advisors and monarchs. It infiltrated every corner of royal life, shaping alliances, friendships, and rivalries in ways that would remain invisible to the public eye for centuries. Courtiers and nobles, though unaware of the pact's full scope, quickly learned that loyalty was a currency far more valuable than gold or land. Actions were measured not just by political consequences, but by whether they aligned with an unseen covenant that demanded obedience and punished deviation. In this environment, even trivial gestures could carry hidden meaning, and subtle errors could result in devastating repercussions. The court became a theater of controlled behavior, where every word, glance, and gesture was scrutinized for hidden compliance or potential defiance. Whispered conversations in corridors carried more weight than public decrees, and the absence of certain individuals at gatherings could speak volumes about loyalty or fear. Monarchs and heirs internalized these pressures, aware that any misstep, however minor, could unravel the delicate web of secrecy that the blood pact demanded. Over time, the court itself became a living instrument of the covenant, enforcing its rules through observation, subtle manipulation, and psychological control. Twist. Rivalries among courtiers were often fueled not solely by ambition, but by the need to interpret, enforce, or anticipate the obligations of the blood pact. Some courtiers, eager to curry favor or ensure their own survival, became the eyes and ears of the covenant, subtly reporting behavior that might indicate disobedience or doubt. In effect, the court itself was transformed into a surveillance network, where even loyalty could be weaponized, and fear was a tool as effective as any sword. These dynamics ensured that the pact's influence extended far beyond formal rituals, permeating the very fabric of courtly life. The stakes of obedience were not purely social. They were deeply personal. Letters and diaries hint at monarchs' private torment as they navigated the pressures of expectation, ambition, and inherited responsibility. One ruler described the sensation of living under 1,000 eyes, all unseen, yet judging every thought, every word, every action, capturing the psychological weight imposed by a covenant that was both invisible and inescapable. Fear, reverence, and respect intertwined to form a constant, silent presence, shaping behavior as effectively as any law or decree. The Blood Pact also had profound implications for political alliances and marriages. Dynastic unions, ostensibly arranged for territory, wealth, or strategic advantage, were often subtly influenced by the need to preserve the covenant. Marriages served to consolidate loyalty, ensure heirs would inherit the obligations of the pact, and prevent knowledge from leaking beyond the inner circle. Scholars studying genealogical patterns note coincidences that defy purely political explanation. Intermarriages among distant cousins, abrupt succession changes, and strategic adoptions that appear driven more by hidden obligations than conventional strategy. The Blood Pact, though invisible, was a guiding hand in the orchestration of Europe's royal network. Twist. Some historians suggest that the Pact's influence extended into espionage, with courtiers and allies deliberately positioned to monitor compliance or manipulate rulers in subtle ways. Diplomatic correspondence, cryptic instructions, and encoded letters reveal a network of oversight that functioned quietly, ensuring that the covenant's obligations were met without overt intervention. In this sense, the Blood Pact acted as both law and intelligence system, shaping behavior not only through fear, but through careful orchestration of knowledge, observation, and subtle coercion. The psychological pressure created by these dynamics was profound. Monarchs became hyper-aware of perception, understanding that appearances mattered as much as deeds. A gesture of trust toward a courtier, a private consultation with an advisor, or a seemingly harmless discussion could have repercussions if interpreted as defiance or weakness. This constant vigilance left rulers isolated, dependent on trusted advisors, and forever attuned to subtle signals of loyalty or disobedience. Diaries from the period describe sleepless nights, anxiety-laden mornings, and the ever-present sense that the covenant's gaze could reach them even in private moments. The human drama of these invisible obligations was amplified by the awareness that the consequences were immediate, precise, and often inexplicable. A courtier's sudden death, a child's mysterious illness, or a sudden reversal of fortune could serve as warning to those within the inner circle. Monarchs understood that obedience was not merely symbolic, it was survival. The Pact created a psychological environment where fear, reverence, and duty were inseparable, producing rulers who were obedient, cautious, and profoundly aware of the unseen forces shaping their decisions. Twist. In some cases, the Blood Pact influenced events far beyond the royal family itself. Wars, treaties, and alliances often appeared driven by conventional political or economic logic, but closer examination reveals the subtle imprint of obligations enforced through secrecy and fear. Advisors, courtiers, and allies ensure that actions aligned with the covenant's demands, creating a ripple effect that extended across Europe. The Pact, though invisible to the public, orchestrated not only individual behavior, but the very course of nations, ensuring that loyalty and secrecy remained paramount above all else. The interplay of fear, loyalty, and ambition created a culture in which rebellion or disobedience was nearly impossible. Monarchs internalized the covenant's power, understanding that even a minor lapse could have catastrophic consequences. Advisors became extensions of the pact itself, subtly guiding decisions and reinforcing obligations. Courtiers acted as monitors, ensuring compliance. And all the while, the monarchs themselves carried the weight of centuries of expectation, the knowledge that their actions would shape not only their own fate, but the destinies of heirs and subjects alike. By the end of this period, the influence of the blood pact was absolute. Monarchs had become vessels of obedience, their personal desires tempered by the unseen authority of the covenant. The court functioned as both theater and instrument, enforcing loyalty through observation, subtle manipulation, and fear. The psychological and social architecture created by the pact ensured that power was never purely individual, but inseparable from the obligations of secrecy, devotion, and inherited fear. In effect, the covenant transformed the very nature of monarchy, creating rulers whose lives were dictated not only by law, strategy, or ambition, but by an invisible, inescapable force that reached across generations. Even today, traces of this influence can be detected. Historical anomalies, sudden shifts in policy, unexplained successions, and mysterious alliances hint at the power of a hidden covenant whose consequences were often fatal to those who failed it. The blood pact was more than a ritual. It was a psychological and social system, one that enforced compliance, shaped dynasties, and dictated the course of history in ways only now beginning to be understood. Its power lay not in armies or wealth, but in the mastery of fear, loyalty, and secrecy, the most enduring forces in human behavior. The blood pact's influence extended beyond the walls of the palace and into the very fabric of European politics, shaping the fate of nations in ways that were invisible to the public eye. Monarchs, bound by the covenant, often made decisions that defied conventional logic, their actions subtly guided by obligations that no one outside the inner circle could comprehend. Wars were initiated, alliances forged, and treaties broken not solely for ambition or territorial gain, but to satisfy the unseen imperatives of a centuries-old covenant that demanded loyalty, secrecy, and fear. To the public, these decisions appeared unpredictable, even irrational, yet within the confines of the pact, they were precise and unavoidable. The shadow of the covenant reached across borders, connecting rulers in distant kingdoms who would otherwise have been bitter rivals. Correspondence between monarchs often contained cryptic language, coded references, and veiled threats, all designed to ensure compliance without revealing the true nature of the pact. The obligations were absolute. Loyalty to the covenant superseded personal ambition, family ties, or even national interest. Those who failed or even hesitated risked consequences that could be sudden and devastating. Chronicles from the period speak of rulers who were mysteriously incapacitated, alliances unraveling, or entire regions thrown into chaos. Events that contemporary historians struggled to explain. Twist. Some events suggest that the pact's influence even shaped revolutions, uprisings, and political coups. A rebellion in one kingdom might have been suppressed not merely by military might, but by the precise orchestration of fear and loyalty dictated by the covenant. Heirs and advisors ensured that key players acted in ways that maintained secrecy and obedience, subtly redirecting the course of history without drawing attention. The public perceived these outcomes as the result of strategy or chance, unaware that an invisible force was guiding the actions of rulers and manipulating the balance of power across Europe. The emotional stakes were profound for those involved. Monarchs and heirs, constantly aware of the covenant's demands, lived in perpetual tension between personal desire and inherited duty. Diaries and letters reveal rulers haunted by the fear of failing the pact, feeling as though every decision carried not only political consequences, but spiritual and psychological weight. One account describes a king pacing the palace halls at midnight, whispering to himself, fearful that the Covenant's unseen eyes could detect the faintest lapse in judgment. Loyalty, ambition, and fear became inseparable, creating a psychological environment where compliance was instinctual and rebellion was inconceivable. The Blood Pact also served as a mechanism of control over advisors, courtiers, and entire royal households. Loyalty was constantly tested, often through subtle, invisible measures. A whispered warning, a seemingly casual remark, or the careful observation of gestures could indicate alignment or defiance. Those who failed to navigate these invisible rules risked exile, disgrace, or disappearance, leaving the public none the wiser. In this way, the Covenant extended its influence not only over monarchs, but over the very structures of power, creating a society in which obedience was both enforced and internalized. Twist. In some kingdoms, the Covenant appears to have influenced succession in ways that historians are only beginning to recognize. Heirs were groomed not only for leadership, but for compliance with rituals and obligations that ensured the continuation of the pact. Sudden abdications, mysterious deaths, or unexpected appointments were often tied to subtle manipulations designed to maintain loyalty and secrecy. These events, while puzzling in their own historical records, reveal a pattern. The Covenant was less a ceremonial tradition and more a living force, shaping dynasties and altering the course of European history with surgical precision. The political reach of the Blood Pact extended to the courts of allies and enemies alike. Monarchs who were unaware of the Covenant's existence were often manipulated indirectly, their policies and alliances influenced by those who understood the hidden obligations of their neighbors. Letters, treaties, and diplomatic missions were often designed to steer rulers toward compliance, ensuring that the Covenant's invisible hand maintained stability and order within the inner circle. Even when kingdoms appeared to act independently, the subtle orchestration of the Blood Pact ensured that loyalty, secrecy, and fear remained central to decision-making. The psychological impact on rulers cannot be overstated. The awareness of the Covenant's power created an omnipresent pressure, a sense that every word, gesture, or decision was observed and judged by forces beyond comprehension. Sleep was often elusive, and even moments of leisure were tinged with anxiety. Monarchs became hypervigilant, aware that their every action could either honor or violate the pact. The consequences were immediate, precise, and often invisible, leaving rulers in a state of constant tension that reinforced the Covenant's authority more effectively than any written law or public decree could. Twist. Beyond fear, the Covenant also inspired awe and reverence. Monarchs recognized that they were participants in a force that transcended individual ambition, connecting them to centuries of predecessors and heirs yet to be born. The rituals, the oaths, and the hidden chambers were not merely instruments of control. They were reminders of a legacy that demanded obedience, respect, and careful management of power. In these moments, the Blood Pact was not just a tool of fear. It was a symbol of continuity, an invisible thread linking rulers across generations, a covenant that shaped history itself. Even today, the influence of the Covenant can be traced through patterns that defy conventional explanation. Wars, alliances, and sudden political shifts often reflect the subtle enforcement of obligations unknown to the wider world. Advisors, courtiers, and heirs acted in concert to preserve secrecy, enforce compliance, and manipulate outcomes, ensuring that the Blood Pact endured despite political upheavals, revolutions, and social change. Its power lay not in brute force, but in the mastery of human behavior, loyalty, and fear, the most enduring forces shaping the course of history. By the end of this period, it became clear that the blood pact was not simply a ceremonial tradition, nor a relic of superstition. It was a living system designed to endure, to control, and to enforce loyalty across generations. Monarchs, advisors, and heirs were bound by obligations invisible to the public, yet tangible in their consequences. The covenant shaped the fate of nations, guided the actions of rulers, and transformed European politics into a web of hidden influence, fear, and devotion. It was in every sense a force of history, silent, invisible, and terrifyingly effective. Despite the blood pact's invisible grip, whispers of rebellion occasionally surfaced. Monarchs, human and fallible, sometimes questioned the covenant's absolute authority, tempted by ambition, desire, or the simple yearning for freedom. These moments of doubt, though fleeting, were perilous. Letters and coded diaries hint at clandestine meetings where rulers debated whether to defy the pact, weighing the rewards of independence against the invisible consequences that loomed like a storm cloud. The internal conflict was immense. The fear of unseen retribution battled against the very human urge to shape one's own destiny. The psychological toll was staggering. Monarchs reported sleepless nights, visions, and an almost tangible sense of judgment pressing upon them. One young king described hearing faint whispers in empty halls, each syllable seeming to echo the commands of the covenant. He wrote of waking to shadows that moved where none should, and of feeling the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders. Even when surrounded by loyal advisors and obedient courtiers, the fear of disobedience was inescapable, a relentless companion that dictated every action and decision. Twist. Some monarchs attempted to subvert the covenant subtly, seeking loopholes or reinterpretations of its rules. Marginalia in ancient manuscripts reveal cryptic notes suggesting that one ruler tried to alter the rituals, believing he could outwit the invisible forces of the pact. The consequences were swift and inexplicable. Advisors fell ill, key allies perished in mysterious accidents, and the monarch himself endured sudden, severe illnesses that threatened his reign. These incidents reinforced the terrifying reality. The blood pact was not only a social and political force. It was a living, reactive power that demanded total compliance. Rebellion was not limited to individual rulers. Entire factions within courts occasionally conspired to challenge the pact, whether out of ambition, fear, or moral objection. Secret councils convened in hidden chambers, discussing strategies to circumvent the covenant's authority. Yet these gatherings were fraught with peril. Some participants vanished without trace. Others were subtly manipulated into obedience, turning potential rebellion into renewed loyalty. The covenant, it seemed, had a way of bending human will, enforcing compliance even when rulers and courtiers believed they were acting independently. The stakes extended far beyond personal survival. The blood pact influenced the fate of entire nations. Decisions made in secret chambers affected wars, treaties, and alliances in ways that appeared irrational or sudden to the wider world. Monarchs who sought to defy the covenant often discovered that external events, famines, rebellions, or sudden deaths among allies, aligned with internal fear to reinforce obedience. Historians now speculate that many seemingly coincidental crises were, in fact, indirect consequences of the pact's invisible enforcement, ensuring that loyalty remained absolute even in the face of human temptation. Twist. In some cases, the pact appeared to possess a preternatural awareness of intent. Monarchs described dreams in which the covenant revealed disapproval, visions of disaster, or cryptic warnings. Diaries hint at rulers waking to find minor accidents or misfortunes coinciding with thoughts of rebellion, creating the impression that the covenant anticipated defiance. Whether psychological, symbolic, or truly supernatural, these experiences reinforced obedience and terror, ensuring that even the boldest monarchs weighed their desires against the unseen consequences of defiance. The emotional complexity of rebellion under the Pact was profound. Monarchs experienced a constant tension between fear, ambition, and conscience. Even those who attempted to act independently often felt guilt, anxiety, and remorse for the unseen consequences of their choices. Letters describe fleeting relief at a perceived victory, immediately followed by dread as unexpected calamities reminded them of the covenant's reach. Rebellion, it seemed, was never truly private. Every thought, every hesitation was potentially observed, judged, and punished, making the psychological burden nearly unbearable. Advisors played a critical role in suppressing rebellion. Trained in the rituals, psychology, and history of the Blood Pact, they monitored behavior for signs of doubt or deviation. They intervened subtly, offering guidance, warnings, or carefully orchestrated coincidences that nudged monarchs back toward obedience. In effect, advisors became extensions of the covenant itself, enforcing loyalty through manipulation rather than force. Their presence ensured that rebellion was not only dangerous but virtually impossible, and that even the most ambitious ruler would ultimately succumb to the weight of centuries of expectation. Twist. Some historians theorize that the covenant used rebellion as a mechanism to strengthen its control. By allowing small acts of doubt or defiance, the pact reinforced its power through fear, demonstrating that even the boldest attempts to subvert it were futile. Monarchs who survived these tests often emerged more cautious, more obedient, and psychologically conditioned to uphold the covenant. In this sense, rebellion was not merely punished. It was instrumental in perpetuating the Blood Pact, ensuring that fear, loyalty, and secrecy were deeply ingrained in the ruling class. The ripple effects of attempted rebellion were felt across generations. Heirs observed the consequences faced by their predecessors, internalizing fear and loyalty before even assuming power. Marginalia in letters suggest that young princes and princesses were often instructed in the fates of those who had dared to challenge the covenant. Their understanding of obedience cemented through observation and instruction. In this way, rebellion, though dangerous, contributed to the hereditary nature of the pact, transmitting both its rituals and its psychological grip from one generation to the next. By the end of this period, it was clear that rebellion could never truly dismantle the covenant. Attempts to evade, reinterpret, or challenge the pact were met with swift, often inexplicable consequences that reinforced obedience. The Blood Pact had become more than ritual. It was a living, reactive force that intertwined politics, psychology, and history. Monarchs, advisors, and heirs operated within its constraints, shaping the destinies of nations according to a covenant whose power remained invisible, omnipresent, and terrifyingly effective. The lesson was chillingly clear. In the shadow of the Blood Pact, even the boldest minds, the most ambitious rulers, and the most cunning advisors were bound by forces they could neither see nor fully understand. Loyalty, secrecy, and fear became the pillars upon which history was written, and rebellion, though occasionally attempted, only served to reinforce the covenant's enduring power. The Blood Pact was not merely a relic of superstition. It was a living, unyielding force, guiding the course of Europe and shaping the lives of rulers in ways that would echo through centuries. Twist. Beyond enforcing loyalty, the hereditary pact acted as a mechanism of control over entire populations. By binding the ruling family together, the covenant indirectly influenced the governance of nations. Policies, wars, and alliances were often subtly guided by the need to maintain secrecy or prevent exposure of the covenant. Historical records hint that some decisions, seemingly made for political or economic reasons, were in fact influenced by the hidden obligations of the blood pact. Entire kingdoms, unknowingly, became part of a system orchestrated in shadow, where the true forces shaping events were hidden from the public eye. The psychological impact on heirs was profound. Letters, diaries, and coded messages suggest that the fear of failing the pact haunted young royals well into adulthood. Dreams were often filled with visions of punishment, ancestral figures admonishing them, or abstract warnings that defied logic. Even as they ascended to power, these rulers carried the weight of centuries of expectation, their every decision informed by an invisible authority. Obedience became second nature, fear a constant companion, and secrecy a defining characteristic of their lives. The pact transformed ordinary human ambition into something far more complex, a mixture of duty, terror, and inherited responsibility. Yet, despite the fear and manipulation, there were moments of awe and reverence. Some heirs wrote of the solemnity of the rituals, the gravity of swearing an oath that connected them to generations past and future. In these moments, loyalty was intertwined with a sense of destiny, a recognition that they were participants in a covenant greater than themselves. The blood pact, terrifying as it was, also inspired devotion, binding rulers not just to the covenant, but to an almost mystical understanding of their role in history. It was a duality of fear and reverence, a constant tension that shaped the emotional and psychological landscape of European royalty. Over the centuries, the hereditary enforcement of the blood pact ensured its survival even through upheaval, war, and revolution. Monarchs adapted, rituals evolved, and the covenant's influence permeated every aspect of royal life. Those who might have questioned its purpose often found themselves silenced by fear, tradition, or the realization that compliance was the only path to survival. And so, the covenant endured, a shadowy thread weaving through the tapestry of European history, binding rulers across generations with a force as invisible as it was inescapable. The story of bloodlines bound by fear is not merely historical, it is a human story. It illustrates the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to secure power, preserve loyalty, and control destiny. It is a tale of psychological manipulation, inherited obligation, and the interplay of fear and reverence. Through the centuries, it demonstrates that the most enduring forces in history are not always written in law or declared openly in public, but are often preserved in shadows, rituals, and the unyielding obligations of those born into power. And so, as generations of monarchs rose and fell, the blood pact endured, a silent arbiter of fate, ensuring that loyalty was never optional, that fear was a constant companion, and that the weight of secrecy shaped lives in ways the public could scarcely imagine. The covenant was eternal, its influence subtle yet pervasive, and its legacy a chilling reminder that some oaths are more powerful than any throne, more binding than any law, and more terrifying than any known force in the world. Letters and diary entries reveal the internal struggles of kings and queens, torn between the human desire for freedom and the psychological and spiritual weight of centuries-old promises. The sacred rituals served as both punishment and reward, terrifying in their implications, yet awe-inspiring in their sense of continuity and power. The covenant's reach extended into political decisions, ensuring that actions taken by monarchs aligned with the obligations reinforced in sacred spaces. Wars, treaties, and marriages were influenced by insights gained from rituals, ensuring that loyalty and secrecy were upheld. Even when decisions seemed to defy conventional logic, they often reflected the hidden influence of sacred ceremonies performed in secret chambers, chapels, and crypts. In this way, the blood pact operated simultaneously as spiritual obligation, political guide, and psychological instrument, shaping the course of European history in ways that remain only partially understood. Twist. Some scholars argue that these sacred rituals also acted as a mechanism of psychological conditioning, preparing monarchs for the stresses of governance under constant scrutiny. By combining fear, reverence, and ritualized obedience, the covenant created rulers who internalized the authority of the pact, making compliance instinctual. Dreams, visions, and experiences of or reinforced the psychological impact, ensuring that monarchs followed the obligations of the covenant without question. In this sense, sacred spaces were not merely sites of ritual. They were laboratories of human behavior, crafting obedience and fear across generations. The hereditary nature of the covenant was reinforced through these sacred rituals. Heirs observed ceremonies from an early age, absorbing both the rules and the emotional weight of the blood pact. Encoded instructions and subtle guidance ensured that knowledge of the covenant was passed along without compromise. Even when monarchs or heirs experienced doubt, the psychological and spiritual conditioning embedded in these rituals ensured continuity. In this way, the sacred spaces of Europe's churches and palaces became crucibles where loyalty, fear, and obedience were forged, ensuring the blood pact's survival across centuries. By the end of this period, it was clear that sacred rituals were indispensable to the covenant's enduring power. They reinforced the authority of the blood pact, linked monarchs to their ancestors, and created a psychological framework that made defiance nearly impossible. The intertwining of religion, secrecy, and fear ensured that rulers internalized their obligations, shaping not only individual lives, but the destinies of entire nations. The blood pact, reinforced in sacred spaces, remained a living, reactive force, a testament to the extraordinary lengths humans will go to preserve secrecy, loyalty, and control. Even today, the traces of these sacred rituals can be found in hidden chapels, crypts, and palaces across Europe. Architectural anomalies, coded inscriptions, and secret passageways hint at a past where obedience, fear, and reverence intertwined in ways that shaped history itself. The blood pact, once enacted in shadowed sanctuaries, continues to fascinate and terrify historians, revealing a force that was as psychological as it was ritualistic, as spiritual as it was political. A covenant whose power transcended mere human understanding and whose influence endures in the shadows of Europe's history. Even with the covenant reinforced through advisors, courts, and sacred rituals, the blood pact's true power lay in its ability to manipulate fear and loyalty on a deeply personal level. Monarchs were not only rulers, but prisoners of their own inherited obligations, constantly aware that deviation could invoke consequences that were sudden, mysterious, and often fatal. Diaries, letters, and marginal notes from the period reveal the constant tension. The desire for personal freedom, the human longing to act independently, was always countered by the weight of centuries of expectation. The covenant had become an invisible architect of behavior, shaping every thought, gesture, and decision in the lives of Europe's most powerful figures. This internalization of fear and loyalty was deliberate. Monarchs learned early that obedience was not merely a formality. It was a survival mechanism. Even the smallest gestures, choosing an advisor, sending a diplomatic letter, or consenting to a marriage, were scrutinized in terms of compliance with the covenant. Every act carried potential consequences, yet these consequences were rarely public, leaving rulers to navigate a psychological labyrinth with invisible walls and unseen observers. The Blood Pact created a reality in which perception, suspicion, and intuition were as vital as political acumen, and where failure could result in loss of power, life, or legacy. Twist. Some monarchs attempted secret acts of defiance, testing the covenant's limits. Marginalia and coded letters reveal rulers who sought to alter ceremonies, conceal alliances, or bypass rituals without alerting the inner circle. These attempts, however subtle, were almost always met with mysterious retribution. Sudden deaths among allies, accidents that destroyed property, or illness that struck without warning. These events reinforced the terrifying lesson that the Blood Pact was both reactive and omnipresent, capable of maintaining obedience even in the absence of overt supervision. The psychological impact was devastating, cementing fear as a permanent companion in the lives of monarchs. The pact also shaped the very notion of power itself. Monarchs realized that authority was inseparable from compliance. Even the grandest ambitions were meaningless without adherence to the covenant. Courtiers and advisors reinforced this lesson daily, subtly testing loyalty through observation, suggestion, or the orchestration of events. The court became a stage, and every participant a player in a drama dictated by a force invisible yet unmistakably present. Monarchs internalized this dynamic, understanding that defiance was not only dangerous, but virtually impossible without risking annihilation, social, political, or personal. Twist. Some historians speculate that the psychological pressure of the covenant produced exceptional rulers, those whose cunning, discipline, and emotional control allowed them to navigate the labyrinth of obligation with unmatched skill. These monarchs were simultaneously terrified and empowered, capable of extraordinary strategy precisely because they understood the boundaries imposed by the Blood Pact. Their successes were not merely the result of talent or circumstance, but of a constant, intimate engagement with fear, obedience, and inherited responsibility. In this sense, the covenant acted as both constraint and catalyst, shaping the most effective rulers in ways that public records cannot fully explain. The emotional toll extended beyond the monarchs themselves. Heirs, often educated in the rituals, letters, and hidden histories of the covenant, experienced the burden before even assuming power. Diaries reveal young princes and princesses witnessing the consequences faced by predecessors who strayed from the pact, internalizing the lessons through observation, fear, and guided instruction. In effect, the Blood Pact created a generational system of control, where knowledge and compliance were transmitted as a psychological inheritance. Children were trained not only in governance, but in the emotional discipline required to uphold a centuries-old covenant that demanded absolute loyalty. The covenant's reach extended into intimate spaces, affecting relationships within royal families. Trust, affection, and familial loyalty were often complicated by fear and obligation. Heirs observed the behavior of parents and siblings, learning that personal bonds could be secondary to compliance. Letters hint at secret rivalries, subtle betrayals, and the quiet policing of behavior within the family itself. The Blood Pact created an environment in which love, ambition, and loyalty were entangled, and where emotional connections were constantly mediated by fear of unseen consequences. Even private moments could carry implications far beyond their apparent significance. Twist. Some families attempted to circumvent the covenant through secrecy or deception, but the consequences were almost always swift and decisive. Unexplained illnesses, sudden deaths, or accidents served as warnings to those who sought independence. These measures reinforced the covenant's psychological dominance, ensuring that obedience was internalized and sustained across generations. In this way, the Blood Pact not only controlled monarchs, but shaped the emotional and relational landscape of entire dynasties, embedding fear and compliance into the very fabric of family life. The Blood Pact also reinforced a sense of destiny, intertwining fear with awe. Monarchs and heirs came to understand that they were participants in a covenant older than any living dynasty, connecting them to rulers past and future. The rituals, the secrets, and the psychological conditioning were not merely mechanisms of control. They were a form of legacy, a binding contract that transcended individual desire. This duality, terrifying and sublime, ensured that monarchs obeyed not only out of fear, but also out of reverence, maintaining the covenant's power through both psychological and emotional means. By the end of this period, it was evident that the Blood Pact had become more than ritual, law, or superstition. It was a living, reactive system, capable of shaping behavior, directing decisions, and influencing the course of nations without ever being publicly acknowledged. Monarchs, advisors, and heirs operated within its constraints, aware that deviation could carry consequences that were immediate, mysterious, and often irreversible. The covenant's enduring power lay not in overt force, but in its mastery of fear, loyalty, and inherited obligation, a subtle yet absolute authority that shaped the course of European history for centuries. The human story embedded in this covenant is profound. It reveals the extraordinary lengths to which humans will go to preserve loyalty, control, and secrecy. Monarchs became both victims and enforcers of a system that demanded obedience through fear, psychological pressure, and ritual. Advisors, courtiers, and clergy became instruments of this unseen power, ensuring that the obligations were observed, transmitted, and enforced. The Blood Pact endured because it operated on the deepest levels of human psychology, binding rulers through fear, reverence, and the inescapable weight of inheritance. Twist. Even today, traces of the covenant remain, hidden in archives, manuscripts, and the subtle architecture of palaces and sacred spaces. Patterns of behavior, unexplained succession changes, and cryptic correspondence suggest a legacy that persists beyond the centuries. The Blood Pact was not merely a historical curiosity. It was a system of influence so sophisticated, so psychologically precise, that its echoes can still be traced in the shadows of European history. Monarchs, though long gone, left behind heirs of behavior, compliance, and fear, a testament to the enduring power of secrecy and inherited obligation. In the end, the Blood Pact transformed the very nature of monarchy. It created rulers who were both powerful and constrained, ambitious and fearful, human yet enmeshed in a covenant older than any living individual. It shaped decisions, alliances, and destinies, intertwining politics, psychology, and ritual into a force that transcended human understanding. The legacy of the covenant is not just in history books. It is in the very structure of power, obedience, and fear that has defined European royalty for centuries, a chilling reminder of what happens when secrecy and loyalty become more powerful than any crown, law, or army. By this stage in history, the blood pact had grown beyond a private covenant between monarchs and advisors. It had become an invisible force that dictated the rhythm of entire courts and kingdoms. Every decision, from the arrangement of a banquet to the direction of a war, was subtly shaped by obligations that few fully understood. Monarchs came to realize that power was inseparable from compliance. Every act of defiance, however minor, carried consequences that could ripple across generations. Even the most mundane details, who sat next to whom, which letters were opened or concealed, became exercises in psychological and political control. The court itself became a crucible of tension and observation. Courtiers learned early that loyalty was both a performance and a measure of survival. Smiles, bows, and words were dissected for hidden meaning, and alliances were forged and broken with a subtle awareness of the covenant's invisible oversight. Monarchs, aware of this constant surveillance, adjusted behavior not only to maintain appearances, but to satisfy the unseen demands of the pact. Diaries from this period reveal rulers who felt perpetually observed, not just by advisors or courtiers, but by the very weight of the covenant itself, as though the centuries of obligation were watching and judging every move. Twist. Some courtiers discovered that they could manipulate the system themselves, subtly steering monarchs through suggestions, rumors, or orchestrated coincidences. By understanding the pact's logic, they gained extraordinary power, influencing decisions that affected kingdoms, alliances, and wars. The blood pact, designed to enforce loyalty, had created a new class of invisible influencers, individuals who wielded authority without title or recognition, shaping history from the shadows while maintaining the illusion of monarchical autonomy. Their cunning ensured that obedience to the covenant became a double-edged sword. Monarchs were powerful yet constrained, rulers yet vessels for unseen control. The human cost of this invisible governance was profound. Monarchs lived under constant psychological pressure, acutely aware that their actions could either honor or violate the covenant. Letters and personal diaries reveal rulers haunted by anxiety, uncertainty, and a relentless fear of unforeseen consequences. Even leisure became suspect. Conversations in gardens or private chambers were weighed against the potential judgment of the covenant. Sleep was often elusive, and many rulers described dreams filled with cryptic warnings or foreboding images, as though the pact itself reached into the subconscious to enforce compliance. The influence of the blood pact extended into dynastic succession. Heirs were not merely taught how to rule, but how to navigate the psychological labyrinth of obligations imposed by the covenant. Marginalia in letters, coded instructions, and discreet mentorship ensured that knowledge of the pact was transmitted carefully, reinforcing loyalty before heirs ever assumed power. Even the tiniest deviation in behavior could trigger subtle, often inexplicable events that reminded successors of the covenant's omnipresence. In this way, the blood pact became a system of intergenerational control, ensuring continuity and reinforcing the psychological grip over monarchs and heirs alike. Twist. Some heirs attempted to exploit the covenant's rules to assert independence or manipulate their elders. Diaries suggest that princes and princesses experimented with minor breaches, testing the boundaries of rituals, alliances, and obedience. Yet the consequences were immediate and often severe. Sudden deaths, mysterious illnesses, or social ruin struck those who dared challenge the covenant, reinforcing the inescapable authority of the pact. These episodes, while rare, illustrate that the blood pact was not static. It actively enforced compliance, teaching obedience through fear and shaping the behavior of rulers before they even assumed the throne. The court became a microcosm of the covenant's power. Every relationship, alliance, and rivalry was filtered through the lens of the blood pact. Courtiers who appeared loyal but harbored ambition were observed, tested, and subtly corrected. Advisors acted as the covenant's instruments, orchestrating outcomes without overt interference. Even monarchs' closest friends and confidants were implicated in the web of observation and influence, reinforcing the psychological tension that bound rulers to centuries of obligation. In this environment, loyalty was both performance and survival strategy, and the consequences of misjudgment could be fatal. Twist: in some cases, the covenant influenced not only politics but culture. Art, literature, and music were used to encode allegiances, commemorate rituals, or subtly communicate instructions to those within the inner circle. Hidden meanings in courtly performances, architectural details, and ceremonial displays ensured that the blood pact's rules and traditions were reinforced visually and psychologically. These cultural imprints extended the covenant's influence beyond politics into the realm of perception and identity, embedding obedience into the very fabric of the court. Monarchs, courtiers, and even the public became unwitting participants in a system that shaped thought, action, and loyalty in subtle, almost invisible ways. The emotional impact of this pervasive control was profound. Monarchs described feelings of isolation, paranoia, and awe, aware that the covenant's influence was invisible yet inescapable. Fear became intertwined with reverence, creating a psychological environment where obedience was instinctive. The weight of centuries of expectation pressed upon every decision, from the allocation of land to the selection of allies, shaping not only political outcomes, but the inner lives of those who ruled. Monarchs internalized the covenant's authority, understanding that their every choice was monitored, judged, and potentially punished by forces beyond their comprehension. The blood pact's power was also evident in its ability to suppress open dissent. Rebellions, conspiracies, and uprisings were rare, as even the boldest courtiers or monarchs feared consequences that were immediate, subtle, and terrifyingly effective. Those who sought to resist often faced mysterious misfortune, sudden deaths, or inexplicable reversals of fortune. These events reinforced the covenant's authority and transmitted lessons of obedience across generations, ensuring that rulers and heirs alike respected and feared the invisible power that shaped every aspect of their lives. By the end of this period, it was clear that the blood pact had become a fundamental force shaping European royalty. It dictated behavior, controlled ambition, and manipulated psychology with an effectiveness that surpassed any army or law. Monarchs were bound by loyalty, fear, and secrecy, while advisors, courtiers, and sacred rituals acted as instruments of control. The covenant transformed the very nature of monarchy, creating rulers who were powerful yet constrained, ambitious yet obedient, human yet inseparable from the obligations of an ancient, invisible force. Twist: even as centuries passed, the covenant adapted, finding new ways to enforce loyalty, communicate across generations, and maintain secrecy. Its influence was subtle, pervasive, and enduring, a force that shaped not only political history but human psychology, culture, and emotion. Monarchs, heirs, and advisors became instruments of a covenant whose power transcended individual will, embedding obedience into the very structure of European royalty. The blood pact was not a relic of superstition. It was a living, reactive system, silently guiding decisions, shaping dynasties, and orchestrating the course of history with precision, subtlety, and enduring authority. The shadow of the blood pact was not confined to kings, queens, and their immediate courts. It extended into the lives of generals, diplomats, and even those who seemed peripheral to power. Military campaigns were often guided not solely by strategy or necessity, but by the covenant's hidden influence. Orders that appeared irrational, maneuvers that defied logic, and alliances that seemed unstable were, in fact, carefully orchestrated to maintain the delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and obligation. Every battlefield, every negotiation, and every treaty became a theater for the covenant's invisible hand. Generals who understood the pact learned to anticipate its subtle dictates, often making decisions that balanced both immediate military needs and the unseen obligations of monarchs. Letters and record from the period suggest that advisors sometimes influenced strategies through seemingly innocuous correspondence, veiled suggestions, or coded directives. The blood pact's power extended into planning and execution, ensuring that outcomes aligned with loyalty to the covenant, even when the stakes involved entire nations. Mistakes were rare. The consequences of deviation were swift, subtle, and often deadly. Twist. Some historians speculate that entire wars were shaped by the covenant's invisible hand. Battles that seemed won or lost by chance may have been influenced by subtle manipulations, logistical disruptions, delays in reinforcements, or changes in orders, all orchestrated to enforce compliance or punish disobedience. Monarchs and generals, though unaware of the full scope of these interventions, often felt as if unseen forces guided outcomes. In this way, the blood pact extended its reach beyond personal loyalty, becoming an instrument capable of shaping history on a continental scale. The emotional burden on military leaders was profound. Many described an acute awareness of being watched, judged, and tested by forces beyond comprehension. Letters reveal sleepless nights, indecision, and anxiety as commanders weighed the immediate demands of warfare against the invisible requirements of the covenant. Success was rarely purely tactical. It depended on navigating a labyrinth of psychological expectations, secret obligations, and unseen consequences. This created a high-pressure environment in which loyalty and fear were as decisive as courage and skill, binding leaders to the pact as firmly as monarchs themselves. The covenant also infiltrated diplomacy. Envoys and ambassadors were instruments of control, often tasked with subtle enforcement of the blood pact. Correspondence between courts contained hidden messages, cryptic references, and carefully veiled threats, all designed to maintain loyalty without revealing the covenant's existence. Negotiations that appeared straightforward often concealed layers of obligation and surveillance, ensuring that rulers could not act independently without risking the invisible consequences dictated by the pact. Diplomatic channels became conduits for the covenant, shaping alliances, influencing treaties, and subtly manipulating entire nations. Twist. Some diplomats discovered that the blood pact could be used to their advantage. By understanding the covenant's hidden rules, they could influence monarchs, guide decisions, or manipulate rival courts. These individuals gained extraordinary power, wielding authority without title or recognition, shaping outcomes across Europe from the shadows. The pact, originally designed to enforce loyalty, had inadvertently created a network of covert influencers, demonstrating that even a system built on fear and obligation could produce opportunities for cunning and ambition. The personal cost to those caught in this web was immense. Monarchs, generals, and diplomats alike faced relentless psychological pressure, constantly aware that a single misstep could trigger consequences ranging from social ruin to unexplained accidents or death. Diaries and letters describe moments of profound isolation, anxiety, and dread. Leaders often felt trapped between personal ambition and the inescapable requirements of the covenant, aware that their every action carried weight far beyond immediate comprehension. Fear and loyalty became inseparable, forming the invisible architecture of their lives. The Blood Pact also created intricate networks of observation and enforcement. Advisors, courtiers, and clergy acted as instruments of control, monitoring behavior, testing loyalty, and subtly manipulating outcomes to ensure adherence. Even seemingly minor actions, a delayed letter, a whispered remark, or a subtle hesitation, could provoke corrective measures, reinforcing the covenant's omnipresence. This system was self-sustaining. Those who enforced obedience often became enmeshed in the same psychological pressures, ensuring the continuation of fear, loyalty, and secrecy across multiple levels of authority. Twist. Some military leaders and diplomats attempted to resist or circumvent these invisible constraints. Marginalia, letters, and reports hint at covert strategies to bypass rituals, delay obligations, or negotiate independence from the covenant's influence. Yet the consequences were immediate and often devastating. Sudden battlefield losses, accidents, or miscommunications ensured that the Pact's authority remained unchallenged. Even the most daring or strategic individuals learned that the Covenant's power was not only omnipresent, but adaptive, responding to defiance with precision and subtlety that left no room for error. The psychological conditioning imposed by the Blood Pact extended across generations. Heirs observed their predecessors navigating these pressures, internalizing fear, loyalty, and obedience as natural parts of governance. Letters, diaries, and coded instructions served as training manuals, ensuring that successors were prepared to operate within the covenant's complex web. By the time they assumed positions of power, they were already psychologically aligned with the Pact's demands, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and reinforcing centuries of inherited compliance. In this way, the covenant became both historical and psychological, shaping the behavior of rulers long before they ascended the throne. The emotional resonance of these pressures was profound. Leaders lived in a constant state of tension, balancing ambition, strategy, and fear. Success was intertwined with survival, and failure, even minor, carried invisible repercussions. This delicate equilibrium created rulers who were both highly capable and deeply constrained, individuals whose extraordinary achievements were inseparable from the psychological discipline enforced by the covenant. Fear, reverence, and loyalty merged into a single, enduring force that guided actions, decisions, and relationships, producing outcomes that shaped the course of European history in ways still visible centuries later. By the end of this period, it was clear that the Blood Pact's influence on military and diplomatic spheres was as profound as its effects on monarchs and heirs. Entire nations were shaped by its invisible hand. Battles were fought under its shadow, and treaties were negotiated with its psychological weight looming over every decision. The covenant had become a multidimensional force, simultaneously political, psychological, and ritualistic, capable of influencing actions, outcomes, and histories with subtlety and precision that left little room for human error. Twist. Even today, the patterns established by the covenant can be traced in historical records. Sudden reversals in war, inexplicable diplomatic outcomes, and extraordinary coincidences hint at the invisible influence that guided decisions, shaped alliances, and enforced loyalty. The Blood Pact's legacy demonstrates the extraordinary power of fear, secrecy, and inherited obligation, a force that molded leaders, dictated outcomes, and wove itself into the very fabric of history, leaving traces that continue to fascinate and haunt scholars and storytellers alike. As the centuries passed, the Blood Pact became entwined not only with rulers and their courts, but with the very identity of European royalty itself. Its influence seeped into traditions, ceremonies, and public appearances, shaping behavior even in moments that appeared spontaneous or ordinary. Crowns were more than symbols of authority. They were markers of compliance, visible reminders that each monarch was bound by obligations older than themselves. Every gesture, every ceremonial act, carried hidden meaning encoded in the rituals and expectations of the covenant. The public face of monarchy, meticulously curated, masked an invisible struggle. Monarchs smiled, feigned confidence, and projected authority, all while navigating the psychological labyrinth of fear, loyalty, and inherited obligation. Letters and diaries hint at private moments of doubt and despair, where rulers questioned the cost of obedience and the morality of a covenant that demanded secrecy, manipulation, and compliance at any cost. Even in the presence of advisors, family, or allies, monarchs felt the unrelenting weight of centuries, their decisions constrained by invisible forces that could not be openly challenged. Twist. Some rulers attempted to use the covenant as a tool for personal ambition. By understanding its hidden rules and the reactions it produced, they maneuvered subtly to consolidate power, manipulate rivals, or gain advantage in court intrigues. The covenant, originally intended to enforce obedience, inadvertently created opportunities for cunning monarchs to wield influence with unprecedented precision. These successes, however, were always accompanied by risk. A single misjudgment could invite swift and mysterious retribution, reinforcing the ever-present balance of fear and power. The emotional burden was compounded by the weight of legacy. Monarchs understood that they were participants in a lineage of rulers bound by the Blood Pact, each generation observing the fates of predecessors who had complied or faltered. Marginalia and personal notes reveal the profound anxiety experienced by heirs, who internalized both the expectations and the terror of past rulers. From childhood, they were educated in the rules, rituals, and psychological discipline necessary to uphold the covenant, ensuring continuity and obedience even before they assumed the throne. The influence of the covenant also extended to alliances and rivalries between royal houses. Marriages, treaties, and dynastic negotiations were carefully orchestrated to reinforce loyalty, maintain secrecy, and consolidate influence across Europe. Even decisions that appeared purely political were shaped by an understanding of the Blood Pact's invisible logic. Monarchs navigated a complex web of obligations, aware that a single misstep could trigger unintended consequences in distant courts, creating ripple effects that reinforced the covenant's authority and perpetuated its influence across borders and generations. Twist. Historians suggest that some wars, territorial expansions, and dynastic conflicts may have been indirectly influenced by the covenant's invisible enforcement. Unexplained reversals of fortune, sudden deaths, and bizarre accidents often coincided with attempts to challenge or subvert the pact, hinting at a reactive force that ensured compliance through extraordinary and often mysterious means. The Blood Pact, it seems, was not passive. It actively shaped the political and social landscape, aligning the ambitions of rulers with the obligations imposed by centuries of secrecy and fear. The psychological conditioning of monarchs was meticulous. Advisors, clergy, and ritual specialists reinforced obedience through subtle, almost imperceptible means: coded warnings, orchestrated coincidences, and careful instruction in the rituals and expectations of the covenant. Monarchs internalized these lessons, developing a heightened sense of vigilance, awareness, and self-discipline. Even minor deviations in behavior, hesitation in decision-making, subtle changes in alliances, or breaches of ritual, could invite corrective measures, ensuring that loyalty was instinctual, fear immediate, and compliance unwavering. The emotional resonance of these pressures shaped personal relationships. Trust, friendship, and familial bonds were all mediated by the covenant's demands. Monarchs learned to navigate alliances carefully, aware that personal loyalty could be compromised by the obligations of the pact. Heirs observed these dynamics from an early age, internalizing lessons about fear, compliance, and secrecy. Even intimate moments, private discussions, and family negotiations were subject to the invisible oversight of the blood pact, creating a court culture defined as much by psychological discipline as by political strategy. Twist: some monarchs attempted clandestine acts of defiance, experimenting with minor breaches in rituals or secret negotiations outside the covenant's purview. Diaries and marginalia suggest that these acts were often met with immediate, inexplicable consequences: advisors falling ill, sudden deaths of allies, or accidents that disrupted carefully laid plans. These events reinforced the inescapable authority of the blood pact, teaching rulers that even subtle defiance carried enormous risk, and that obedience was the only sustainable path to survival and influence. The covenant's subtle enforcement extended into public ceremonies and cultural expressions. Architecture, art, music, and literature became tools to encode loyalty, communicate allegiances, and reinforce the psychological conditioning of rulers. Hidden symbols, allegorical narratives, and carefully orchestrated displays ensured that the principles of the blood pact were transmitted visually, emotionally, and symbolically. Monarchs, courtiers, and even the general populace participated unknowingly in a system that embedded obedience and fear into the very fabric of culture, making the covenant both invisible and omnipresent. The legacy of the blood pact, by this time, was unmistakable. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and entire nations had internalized its logic, ensuring continuity of obedience, loyalty, and fear across centuries. The covenant's influence was as much psychological as it was political, shaping behavior, decisions, and relationships in ways that were nearly imperceptible yet profoundly effective. Monarchs were powerful, yet constrained, ambitious, yet disciplined, human, yet inextricably bound to obligations that transcended their individual will. By the end of this period, it was evident that the blood pact had become the invisible spine of European royalty. It dictated conduct, shaped alliances, and enforced psychological discipline with precision. Monarchs operated within its invisible framework, aware that deviation could produce mysterious, immediate consequences. Advisors, courtiers, and ritual specialists acted as both enforcers and transmitters, ensuring that the covenant's reach extended across generations. The blood pact had transcended mere ritual or law. It had become a living, reactive system, silently shaping history, guiding decisions, and molding the behavior of rulers with an authority that was simultaneously terrifying and sublime. Twist: even today, traces of the covenant linger in subtle patterns. The architecture of palaces, cryptic inscriptions, and historical anomalies hint at a system that demanded secrecy, loyalty, and compliance. The psychological and cultural conditioning it produced can still be traced in the structure, expectations, and behaviors of royalty. The blood pact, though centuries old, demonstrates the enduring power of fear, secrecy, and inherited obligation, a force that transcends individuals, shaping dynasties, history, and the very notion of power itself. As the Blood Pact entrenched itself further into the fabric of European royalty, its influence began to manifest in unexpected, almost eerie ways. The covenant was no longer merely a system of rules, rituals, and obedience. It had become a force that seemed to anticipate events, shaping not only decisions, but the very flow of history. Monarchs and their advisors began to speak of uncanny coincidences, of decisions that seemed guided by unseen hands, and of outcomes that defied conventional explanation. The Blood Pact had moved from ceremony and tradition into the realm of intuition, perception, and psychological influence, subtly orchestrating events across kingdoms and generations. Historians have long noted patterns in succession, diplomacy, and warfare that suggest the covenant's influence was both deliberate and reactive. Monarchs who displayed even subtle defiance often encountered immediate, mysterious setbacks, sudden reversals in policy, inexplicable illness among allies, or unexpected failures in military campaigns. Conversely, those who demonstrated meticulous obedience appeared unusually fortunate, their reigns marked by stability, prosperity, and longevity. These patterns were recorded in letters, diaries, and chronicles, though rarely understood for what they truly represented, a reactive system of control that transcended conventional authority. Twist. Some scholars propose that the Blood Pact functioned almost like an invisible intelligence, a system capable of responding to the psychological and moral alignment of monarchs. The covenant's influence was subtle yet precise, ensuring that loyalty and fear were continuously reinforced. Rulers who tried to manipulate or circumvent its mechanisms often found themselves ensnared in inexplicable consequences, demonstrating that the pact's reach extended beyond human understanding. In effect, the Blood Pact had become a force of history itself, shaping the destinies of nations through an invisible psychological web. The emotional toll on monarchs was profound. Letters and personal accounts describe the constant tension of living under a system that monitored intentions as carefully as actions. Even routine governance, approving laws, negotiating treaties, or convening courts, carried the weight of centuries of obligation. Monarchs internalized the covenant's demands, their thoughts, fears, and desires forever shaped by the knowledge that unseen forces were observing, evaluating, and reacting to their behavior. The Blood Pact became a permanent companion, blending psychological discipline with emotional intensity, producing rulers who were both extraordinarily capable and perpetually constrained. Courtiers and advisors played an essential role in maintaining this invisible order. Those who understood the covenant's logic became indispensable intermediaries, subtly guiding decisions, interpreting signs, and orchestrating outcomes that aligned with the pact's requirements. Letters and marginalia suggest that some advisors wielded extraordinary influence, shaping alliances, marriages, and political maneuvers from the shadows. Their role was not merely administrative but psychological, ensuring that monarchs remained compliant, aware of the covenant's expectations, and unable to deviate without incurring mysterious consequences. Twist. In some cases, these intermediaries wielded power rivaling that of monarchs themselves. By interpreting the covenant's subtle signals, they could manipulate events, guide strategy, and influence outcomes without ever overtly asserting authority. Monarchs, while outwardly in control, were in many ways enmeshed in a system of influence that transcended direct governance. The Blood Pact originally intended to enforce obedience, had inadvertently created a network of covert power, where control was as psychological as it was ceremonial or political. The covenant also shaped cultural expressions. Art, music, and literature became vehicles for encoding allegiances, reinforcing loyalty, and communicating subtle messages across courts. Paintings contained hidden symbols, poetry carried allegorical meaning, and performances reinforced the psychological conditioning necessary to maintain compliance. Monarchs and courtiers internalized these cultural cues, ensuring that the covenant's influence extended beyond direct observation into the very perception and understanding of those within royal spheres. The blood pact's subtle artistry transformed culture into a tool of psychological governance. The intergenerational impact of the covenant was equally striking. Heirs, observing the behavior of monarchs and advisors, absorbed lessons in obedience, fear, and psychological discipline from a young age. Marginalia, letters, and diaries reveal the careful training that prepared successors to navigate the labyrinthine expectations of the blood pact. Even before assuming power, heirs were conditioned to internalize the covenant's demands, ensuring that knowledge, fear, and loyalty were transmitted across generations. The blood pact had become both historical and psychological, shaping rulers before they ever set foot on a throne. Twist. Some heirs attempted subtle resistance, testing the boundaries of rituals or questioning advisors' interpretations. Historical accounts suggest that these acts were often met with swift, inexplicable consequences, sudden illness, accidents, or political setbacks. These reactions reinforced the covenant's authority, teaching that compliance was not merely a formality, but a survival imperative. The blood pact was reactive, adaptive, and omnipresent, ensuring that even subtle acts of defiance carried immediate and often terrifying results. The emotional resonance of the covenant extended beyond rulers to entire courts. Relationships, alliances, and rivalries were mediated through the lens of loyalty and fear, creating a culture of tension and vigilance. Trust was fragile, and even private interactions carried the potential for consequences if interpreted as misalignment with the pact. Monarchs, advisors, and heirs internalized these dynamics, creating a psychological environment in which fear, reverence, and loyalty were inseparable, shaping not only behavior, but the emotional and social fabric of royal life. By the end of this period, the blood pact's influence was unmistakable. Monarchs were simultaneously powerful and constrained, ambitious yet disciplined, human yet inseparable from centuries-old obligations. Wars, treaties, marriages, and governance were shaped as much by unseen psychological and ceremonial pressures as by strategy or circumstance. Advisors, courtiers, and cultural mechanisms acted as instruments of enforcement, ensuring that the covenant's reach extended across generations, nations, and even the collective imagination of those who participated in its hidden rituals. Twist. Even in modern scholarship, subtle patterns hint at the enduring legacy of the blood pact. Unexplained decisions, sudden reversals, and extraordinary coincidences suggest the influence of a system that combined ritual, secrecy, and psychological conditioning. The covenant's reach demonstrates the extraordinary power of fear, loyalty, and inherited obligation, a force that transcended individuals, shaped dynasties, and orchestrated history with precision, subtlety, and enduring authority. The blood pact, in this stage, was no longer a relic of superstition. It had become a living, reactive system, silently shaping decisions, enforcing compliance, and guiding the flow of history. Monarchs, advisors and heirs were simultaneously participants, enforcers, and instruments of a covenant that demanded secrecy, loyalty, and psychological alignment. Fear and reverence merged, ensuring that obedience was internalized and instinctive. The legacy of the Blood Pact is not merely historical. It is a testament to the extraordinary lengths humans will go to preserve control, secrecy, and the continuity of power across centuries. As the Blood Pact deepened its grip on European royalty, its influence began to infiltrate areas of governance that seemed distant from ritual or ceremony. Monarchs discovered that even legal systems, financial policies, and administrative decisions were subtly shaped by the covenant's invisible framework. Advisors carefully guided rulers, not only through court etiquette, but through intricate policies designed to reinforce loyalty and obedience. The Pact's unseen hand ensured that power was exercised in ways that maintained the delicate balance of fear, authority, and intergenerational continuity. Every decree, tax allocation, and judicial decision carried hidden weight, reflecting centuries of obligation embedded within the very act of governance. Records from the period reveal that monarchs often hesitated before implementing decisions, fully aware that their choices could invoke unseen consequences. A law passed hastily, a treaty signed without consultation, or a tax adjustment that displeased the wrong faction could trigger mysterious accidents, sudden deaths, or political upheavals that seemed coincidental but were anything but random. The Blood Pact functioned like an invisible corrective force, ensuring that deviation from compliance was met with rapid, precise, and often subtle retribution. Monarchs came to internalize this logic, making fear, caution, and psychological calculation inseparable from governance itself. Twist. Some advisors discovered they could exploit the covenant's subtle mechanisms to consolidate influence. By interpreting the covenant's invisible logic, they could manipulate monarchs, steer policy, or orchestrate outcomes that aligned with their own ambitions. This created a hidden layer of power within royal courts, where authority was exercised not only through official titles, but through mastery of the covenant's psychological and ceremonial dictates. Monarchs, while outwardly commanding, often operated under invisible constraints that dictated the range of acceptable decisions and actions. The emotional burden on rulers was immense. Diaries and personal letters reveal monarchs consumed by anxiety, doubt, and a persistent awareness of potential consequences that could arise from the slightest misstep. Even routine administrative duties carried psychological weight, as each action was scrutinized for its alignment with centuries of inherited obligation. Monarchs became trapped between personal ambition and the inescapable demands of the Blood Pact, forced to navigate a labyrinth where every choice could carry profound consequences, both immediate and generational. The covenant also had a profound influence on intermonarch relations. Alliances, marriages, and treaties were often negotiated not only for political gain, but to reinforce compliance and maintain the delicate balance enforced by the Blood Pact. Even seemingly minor acts of diplomacy, gifts, favors, or ceremonial acknowledgments were imbued with layers of meaning, carrying implications for loyalty and adherence. Monarchs, acutely aware of these subtleties, became skilled in interpreting and anticipating the psychological and ceremonial expectations embedded within every interaction. Twist. In several cases, historians note that unexpected diplomatic outcomes or sudden reversals in alliances may have been influenced by the covenant's hidden hand. Monarchs who appeared defiant or indecisive often experienced immediate misfortunes, failed negotiations, sudden betrayals, or mysterious obstacles that altered the course of history. Conversely, Rulers who exhibited careful compliance seemed unusually fortunate, suggesting that the covenant's influence was reactive, precise, and pervasive, shaping not only personal behavior but the destiny of entire nations. The psychological conditioning imposed by the blood pact was further reinforced through ceremonial displays and cultural rituals. Festivals, religious observances, and public ceremonies were meticulously designed to encode allegiances, signal compliance, and subtly communicate warnings or approval. Monarchs internalized these cultural cues, learning to navigate a complex system of symbols, gestures, and performances that carried consequences far beyond their apparent significance. The blood pact thus transformed public culture into an instrument of psychological governance, embedding fear, loyalty, and obedience into both perception and action. Generational continuity was another critical aspect of the covenant's influence. Heirs were trained from birth to observe the behavior of predecessors, internalize lessons of fear and compliance, and understand the subtle signals embedded in rituals, letters, and courtly practices. Diaries and marginalia indicate that children were educated not only in governance, but in the psychological discipline required to uphold centuries-old obligations. By the time they ascended to the throne, heirs had internalized the covenant's logic, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and ensuring the continuity of obedience across generations. Twist. Some heirs attempted to test or circumvent the pact's constraints, experimenting with secret negotiations, minor breaches of ritual, or private alliances. Historical records reveal that these experiments were often met with swift, inexplicable consequences, sudden deaths, accidents, or failures that seemed coincidental but reinforced the inescapable authority of the covenant. These episodes demonstrate that the blood pact was not passive. It actively enforced compliance, responding to defiance with precision and subtlety, leaving rulers acutely aware of the risks inherent in disobedience. The emotional and social impact of the blood pact was profound. Monarchs, advisors, heirs, and even peripheral courtiers operated in a state of constant vigilance, aware that every decision, gesture, and conversation could carry hidden consequences. Trust was fragile, relationships were complicated, and the psychological landscape of royal life was shaped by fear, loyalty, and secrecy. The covenant created a culture in which obedience was internalized and deviation, even minor, could threaten both survival and legacy. By this stage, the blood pact had become a defining feature of monarchy itself. It shaped governance, diplomacy, military strategy, and cultural expression, ensuring that the behaviors of rulers aligned with centuries of inherited obligation. Monarchs were powerful, yet constrained, influential, yet bound by psychological and ceremonial imperatives that transcended individual will. Advisors, courtiers, and cultural rituals acted as instruments of enforcement, creating a system of invisible authority that was both subtle and absolute. Twist. Even today, the influence of the blood pact can be traced in historical anomalies, unexplained political outcomes, and patterns of behavior within royal lineages. The covenant's combination of secrecy, psychological conditioning, and ceremonial reinforcement created a force that transcended generations, shaping history in ways that remain partially hidden and largely misunderstood. Its legacy is a testament to the extraordinary power of fear, loyalty, and inherited obligation, demonstrating that true influence often operates not through overt authority, but through subtle, invisible mechanisms that guide decisions, relationships, and the course of history itself. In the end, the blood pact at this stage was no longer a simple covenant. It had become a living, reactive system, shaping decisions, guiding behavior, and enforcing loyalty across courts, generations, and nations. Monarchs, heirs, and advisors were simultaneously participants, enforcers, and instruments of a system that demanded secrecy, psychological alignment, and obedience. Fear and reverence were inseparable, creating rulers who were both capable and constrained, ambitious and disciplined, human yet inextricably bound to obligations older than themselves. The covenant had transcended law, ritual, and tradition. It had become an invisible force that orchestrated history itself. By this stage in history, the blood pact had evolved beyond a network of rules, rituals, and obligations into a fully integrated psychological and political system. Monarchs were no longer merely subjects of its authority. They had become living instruments through which the covenant expressed its power. Decisions in governance, diplomacy, and even personal relationships were influenced as much by fear, ritual, and psychological conditioning as by practical necessity. Diaries and letters from this period reveal rulers acutely aware of being constantly tested, monitored, and subtly guided by an invisible force whose presence was felt but never directly acknowledged. The influence of the covenant extended into the very structure of monarchies. Administrators, advisors, and courtiers were all enmeshed in a web of observation and enforcement. Their role was not merely to advise, but to act as the covenant's eyes and instruments, monitoring loyalty, interpreting signals, and subtly manipulating outcomes to maintain compliance. Even minor deviations, a hesitant gesture, a cryptic remark, or an unexpected alliance, could provoke corrective measures, often swift and untraceable. Monarchs internalized this system, developing an almost instinctive awareness of the pact's invisible parameters and the consequences of misalignment. Twist. Some advisors leveraged this understanding to wield extraordinary influence, sometimes surpassing that of the monarchs themselves. By interpreting subtle signs, orchestrating minor events, or guiding rulers' perceptions, they could manipulate outcomes without overtly asserting authority. Monarchs, while outwardly in control, often operated within an invisible framework that constrained freedom, guided decisions, and subtly directed the course of kingdoms. The covenant, designed to enforce loyalty, had created a hidden network of power that functioned independently of official titles or ceremonial positions. Military strategy was particularly shaped by the covenant's influence. Generals and commanders often reported decisions or outcomes that seemed inexplicable or contrary to conventional logic, yet aligned perfectly with the unseen demands of the blood pact. Delays, reversals, and unexpected alliances frequently coincided with subtle compliance or defiance, reinforcing the perception that the covenant actively influenced events. Monarchs learned to navigate campaigns not only with tactical skill, but with psychological acuity, anticipating the covenant's unseen reactions to their strategies and adjusting plans accordingly. The emotional toll of this invisible system was immense. Monarchs experienced chronic anxiety, heightened vigilance, and a persistent sense of responsibility not only for immediate outcomes, but for the covenant's broader expectations. Even minor missteps could trigger mysterious consequences, creating a psychological environment in which fear, reverence, and obedience became inseparable. Letters and diaries reveal rulers struggling with isolation, doubt, and a profound weight of obligations that transcended their personal will, shaping every aspect of thought, action, and decision-making. Twist. In some cases, monarchs attempted secretive acts of defiance, exploring loopholes or negotiating outside the covenant's constraints. Historical records suggest that these efforts were often met with immediate, seemingly inexplicable setbacks, accidents, sudden illnesses, or political failures that reinforce the covenant's authority. These episodes demonstrate that the blood pact was not passive. It reacted to defiance with precision, subtly guiding events to maintain compliance and reinforce the perception of its omnipresence. The covenant's influence extended into diplomacy and international relations. Alliances, marriages, and treaties were carefully calibrated to align with the covenant's invisible logic. Even minor gestures, gifts, ceremonial acknowledgments, or expressions of favor carried meaning, signaling compliance or defiance. Monarchs and their envoys learned to read these signals meticulously, understanding that misinterpretation could result in sudden reversals, betrayals, or mysterious obstacles that seemed coincidental but were carefully orchestrated to enforce obedience. Cultural expressions became another vehicle for the covenant's subtle influence. Music, art, literature, and ceremonial architecture encoded allegiances, reinforced loyalty, and communicated warnings or instructions across generations. Hidden symbols, allegorical narratives, and theatrical performances ensured that the covenant's authority was transmitted visually, emotionally, and psychologically. Monarchs, courtiers, and even the public participated unknowingly in these subtle mechanisms, embedding fear, loyalty, and compliance into the very fabric of cultural expression. Twist. Some cultural artifacts appear to have been intentionally designed to influence perception and behavior. Paintings, tapestries, and architecture often contained hidden references or symbols intended to reinforce obedience or communicate allegiances. Monarchs who understood these cues could navigate the psychological landscape more effectively, while those unaware risked subtle forms of social or political correction. The covenant had evolved into a multidimensional system, blending politics, ritual, and cultural influence into a force that shaped behavior with almost supernatural precision. Generational continuity remained a central pillar of the covenant's power. Heirs observed their predecessors' actions, internalized lessons of fear and compliance, and were instructed in subtle rituals and psychological principles designed to maintain loyalty. From early childhood, education emphasized not only governance, but an understanding of the covenant's invisible parameters. By the time heirs ascended to the throne, they were conditioned to operate within the system, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and ensuring the covenant's endurance across centuries. Twist. Some heirs experimented with minor breaches, testing the boundaries of the covenant or exploring secret channels of influence. These acts were almost invariably met with mysterious consequences: sudden illness, political setbacks, or accidents that seemed coincidental but reinforced the covenant's authority. Such events confirmed that the blood pact was adaptive, reactive, and omnipresent, capable of shaping behavior with precision and subtlety that left rulers in awe, fear, and cautious reverence. The psychological and social impact of the covenant was profound. Monarchs, advisors, heirs, and even peripheral courtiers lived in a state of constant vigilance. Every decision, conversation, and gesture was weighed against the covenant's invisible standards. Trust was fragile, alliances were precarious, and obedience became instinctual. Fear, loyalty, and psychological conditioning merged into a single, enduring force, shaping not only political outcomes, but the emotional and social fabric of royal life. By this period, it was clear that the blood pact had become an inseparable element of monarchy itself. It shaped policy, diplomacy, military strategy, cultural expression, and personal behavior. Monarchs were powerful yet constrained, influential yet bound by obligations that transcended their personal will. Advisors, courtiers, and cultural mechanisms acted as instruments of enforcement, ensuring that the covenant's reach extended across generations, nations, and spheres of influence. Twist. Even centuries later, historians can trace patterns that suggest the covenant's enduring impact. Unexplained reversals, sudden deaths, and subtle coincidences hint at a force that combines secrecy, psychological conditioning, and ritual enforcement. The Blood Pact was no longer simply a historical phenomenon. It had become a lens through which the continuity of power, compliance, and influence can be understood. A silent architect of history, shaping the destinies of monarchs, dynasties, and entire nations with subtle yet unyielding authority. As the Blood Pact entrenched itself further into European royalty, its influence extended into the very architecture of power. Thrones, palaces, and ceremonial halls were not merely symbols of authority. They were physical manifestations of the covenant's invisible control. Hidden passages, cryptic inscriptions, and carefully designed spatial hierarchies encoded allegiance and loyalty, guiding rulers' movements, decisions, and even the flow of audiences and ceremonies. Architecture became both a tool of enforcement and a reminder. Monarchs operated in a world where obedience was demanded not only through ritual, but through every tangible environment surrounding them. Records from the period suggest that these architectural cues were far from superficial. Private chambers were positioned to reinforce hierarchy. Corridors were designed to control access to influence, and ceremonial halls carried embedded instructions in their proportions and ornamentation. Monarchs learned to interpret these spaces intuitively, understanding that a misstep in movement, attention, or ritual could trigger consequences invisible to the untrained eye. Even advisors and courtiers internalized these spatial cues, participating in a subtle choreography that reinforced the covenant's authority. Twist. Some architects and ritual specialists wielded extraordinary influence, shaping the psychological landscape of rulers and courts through design. By embedding hidden signals, visual hierarchies, and symbolic markers, they could subtly guide behavior, enforce loyalty, or even intimidate monarchs. The Blood Pact's influence, therefore, extended beyond letters, rituals, or advisors. It became a living, spatially mediated system, shaping perception, decision-making, and compliance with invisible precision. The emotional burden of navigating such an environment was profound. Monarchs operated in constant awareness that their surroundings were part of the covenant's enforcement mechanism. A misstep in ceremony, a hesitation in entering a chamber, or a breach of ritual could provoke mysterious outcomes, sudden political setbacks, accidents, or unexpected reversals. This constant vigilance created a psychological environment of heightened anxiety and acute awareness, where fear and loyalty merged into instinctual responses that shaped every action and decision. Cultural expression intersected with architectural and ceremonial enforcement. Palaces and halls were adorned with paintings, tapestries, and sculptures that carried hidden meanings, symbols of allegiance, warnings of disobedience, or reminders of the covenant's invisible power. Monarchs were trained to interpret these cues. Courtiers learned to reinforce their significance through behavior, speech, and ritual. The covenant's authority, therefore, became embedded in a multidimensional system, intertwining environment, culture, and ceremony into an almost omnipresent mechanism of control. Twist. In some cases, seemingly minor modifications in palace design or ceremonial layout were used to test obedience or signal favor. Monarchs who understood the subtle cues gained extraordinary insight into the covenant's expectations, while those unaware risked subtle forms of correction. The Blood Pact had evolved into a multidimensional system, blending politics, ritual, architecture, and culture into a cohesive force capable of shaping thought, behavior, and history itself. Generational continuity remained central to the covenant's power. Heirs were not only educated in governance and ritual, but also trained to interpret the architectural, cultural, and ceremonial signals embedded in their environment. Observing predecessors, understanding spatial hierarchies, and internalizing ritualized cues ensured that heirs were conditioned to operate within the covenant's invisible framework from an early age. By the time they ascended to the throne, they were psychologically aligned with centuries of obligation, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and perpetuating the covenant's influence across generations. The psychological and social impact of these invisible mechanisms was profound. Monarchs, advisors, heirs, and courtiers existed in a state of constant vigilance, aware that every action, gesture, and decision could trigger unseen consequences. Trust and loyalty were continually tested. Fear became a constant companion, guiding behavior and reinforcing the covenant's authority. Emotional tension, anxiety, and acute awareness of invisible oversight shaped personal relationships, alliances, and rivalries, creating a court culture defined as much by psychological discipline as by political strategy. Twist: some monarchs attempted subtle defiance, experimenting with deviations in ritual, ceremonial behavior, or spatial navigation. Historical records indicate that these acts often led to sudden, unexplained events, accidents, political setbacks, or mysterious reversals that reinforced the covenant's authority. The Blood Pact had become a living system, capable of reacting with precision and subtlety, teaching rulers that compliance was not merely recommended but essential for survival and success. The covenant's integration into governance was equally pervasive. Advisors and officials acted as instruments of enforcement, monitoring decisions, interpreting signals, and guiding behavior in alignment with centuries-old obligations. Even minor administrative actions, such as issuing decrees, managing resources, or resolving disputes, were influenced by the covenant's invisible presence. Monarchs learned to internalize these parameters, making fear, loyalty, and psychological calculation inseparable from governance itself. Twist: evidence suggests that some advisors and court specialists developed mastery over the covenant's mechanisms, enabling them to shape decisions, alliances, and outcomes from the shadows. Monarchs, though outwardly in control, operated within a framework that constrained freedom, guided choices, and subtly directed the course of kingdoms. The Blood Pact, initially a tool for enforcing obedience, had transformed into a network of hidden power, with influence as psychological and spatial as it was ceremonial and political. By this period, the Blood Pact had become inseparable from monarchy. It dictated behavior, shaped alliances, guided decisions, and enforced loyalty across multiple dimensions: psychological, ceremonial, cultural, and architectural. Monarchs were simultaneously powerful and constrained, ambitious yet disciplined, human yet inextricably bound to centuries of obligations. Advisors, courtiers, and cultural mechanisms acted as instruments of enforcement, ensuring that compliance was both instinctual and unavoidable. Twist: even in contemporary historical analysis, subtle patterns point to the covenant's enduring impact. Unexplained outcomes, sudden reversals, and recurring coincidences hint at a system that combines psychological conditioning, ritual enforcement, and spatial signaling. The Blood Pact was no longer simply a historical curiosity. It was a testament to the extraordinary power of secrecy, inherited obligation, and subtle control, a force that shaped rulers, dynasties, and the trajectory of European history itself. The covenant, in this stage, had transcended ritual, law, and tradition. It had become an invisible, reactive system that guided behavior, enforced loyalty, and shaped history across centuries. Monarchs, heirs, and advisors were simultaneously participants, enforcers, and instruments of this force, bound by fear, reverence, and inherited responsibility. The blood pact had become the invisible architecture of power itself, orchestrating events with precision, subtlety, and an enduring authority that demanded both obedience and awe. As the covenant's influence permeated deeper into the structures of European royalty, its reach extended beyond individual rulers and courts to entire nations. The blood pact, though cloaked in secrecy, began to influence diplomacy, trade, and international relations, shaping the fates of kingdoms in subtle but decisive ways. Monarchs, heirs, and advisors became participants in a system that orchestrated outcomes across borders, ensuring that alliances, conflicts, and treaties aligned with centuries-old obligations. The invisible hand of the covenant moved silently, guiding nations while remaining imperceptible to those outside its secretive web. Historical records indicate that the Pact's influence often manifested in sudden, inexplicable reversals. A treaty that seemed destined for success could fail without warning, a military campaign could falter at a critical moment, or a diplomatic negotiation could collapse inexplicably. These events, initially dismissed as coincidence, appear to align with the covenant's subtle mechanisms of enforcement. Monarchs and their advisors gradually came to recognize that their fates were intertwined with the invisible obligations imposed by the pact, understanding that compliance and foresight were essential to survival and success. Twist. Some scholars suggest that certain major conflicts, territorial disputes, and dynastic shifts were subtly orchestrated or influenced by the covenant. Decisions that appeared spontaneous or politically motivated may have been guided by an unseen force, ensuring outcomes that reinforced obedience, loyalty, and continuity. Monarchs who attempted defiance often suffered immediate setbacks, while those who aligned with the covenant's expectations found their reigns unusually prosperous, suggesting that the blood pact operated as a reactive, almost intelligent system. The emotional and psychological pressures on rulers were immense. Monarchs lived under constant scrutiny, aware that every choice carried implications beyond the immediate. Letters and diaries from this period describe the anxiety, doubt, and vigilance that defined royal life, as rulers weighed every decision against the invisible standards of the covenant. Even intimate relationships, personal alliances, and familial interactions were affected, as fear of misalignment with the pact shaped behavior, trust, and loyalty. Monarchs were powerful, yet perpetually constrained, their ambitions tempered by centuries of inherited obligation. Advisors and courtiers were crucial instruments of enforcement. Those who mastered the covenant's subtle logic held extraordinary influence, guiding monarchs' decisions, interpreting hidden signs, and orchestrating events to maintain compliance. Their authority often rivaled that of the rulers themselves, as they manipulated outcomes without overt displays of power. Monarchs, though ostensibly in command, were participants in a complex psychological and ceremonial system that constrained freedom while reinforcing loyalty. The covenant had thus evolved into a multidimensional network of influence, blending governance, ritual, and subtle manipulation. Twist. In some cases, seemingly minor acts of disobedience or deviation from ritual led to immediate consequences. Sudden deaths, accidents, or political failures that seemed coincidental but reinforced the covenant's authority. These events taught rulers that even subtle defiance carried immense risk, and that survival and success depended on understanding and internalizing the covenant's invisible mechanisms. The blood pact had become not just a system of obligations, but a reactive, adaptive force shaping both personal and national destinies. The covenant also left its mark on culture and public life. Ceremonies, festivals, and public performances were designed to reinforce loyalty, signal compliance, and communicate subtle warnings. Art, music, and literature became carriers of encoded meaning, transmitting expectations, allegiances, and instructions across generations. Monarchs learned to interpret these cues, understanding that behavior observed publicly could have private consequences, and that cultural literacy was as essential as political acumen in navigating the covenant's hidden demands. Generational continuity was meticulously enforced. Heirs observed the behavior of predecessors, internalized lessons of fear, compliance, and psychological discipline, and were educated to recognize the subtle signals embedded in ritual, culture, and architecture. By the time they assumed power, heirs were conditioned to operate within the covenant's invisible framework, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and ensuring that centuries-old obligations were transmitted seamlessly across generations. The blood pact was no longer simply a set of rules. It had become a living, evolving system that shaped rulers before they ever ascended to the throne. Twist. Some heirs attempted to challenge or evade the covenant's constraints, experimenting with secretive negotiations, minor breaches of ritual, or clandestine alliances. These acts were often met with swift, mysterious repercussions, sudden illnesses, political reversals, or accidents that seemed coincidental but were intricately aligned with the covenant's invisible logic. Such events demonstrated the system's precision and adaptability, reinforcing the perception that obedience was not optional and that the covenant's influence extended beyond comprehension into the very course of history. The social and emotional dynamics within courts were equally profound. Fear, loyalty, and psychological discipline dictated relationships between monarchs, advisors, heirs, and courtiers. Trust was fragile, and alliances were carefully calibrated to balance ambition, obedience, and survival. Emotional tension permeated every interaction, creating a culture in which instinctive compliance became a survival mechanism. The covenant's reach was both subtle and absolute, shaping not only decisions and outcomes, but the very psychology of those who lived within its sphere of influence. Twist. Even in retrospect, subtle patterns in historical records point to the covenant's enduring power. Unexplained reversals, sudden deaths, and seemingly coincidental successes hint at a system that combines secrecy, ritual, psychological conditioning, and strategic manipulation. The blood pact had evolved into a force capable of guiding not only individual rulers, but entire nations, shaping alliances, conflicts, and dynastic trajectories with precision and subtlety. By this stage, the blood pact had become inseparable from the course of European history. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and courts were enmeshed in a system that guided decisions, enforced loyalty, and subtly orchestrated outcomes. Its influence extended across generations, nations, and cultural expressions, blending ritual, psychological conditioning, and strategic manipulation into an almost omnipresent force. Monarchs were powerful, yet constrained, influential, yet inextricably bound by obligations that transcended personal will. The blood pact had become the invisible hand shaping history itself, orchestrating the destinies of rulers, dynasties, and kingdoms with unerring precision. By the time the blood pact reached its mature stage, its influence was no longer confined to individual rulers, courts, or kingdoms. It had begun to subtly manipulate the broader currents of European politics and society. Monarchs were no longer merely instruments of the covenant. Entire nations seemed to move according to its invisible rhythms. Alliances formed and dissolved in patterns that historians today still struggle to explain. Wars erupted with a timing that suggested unseen orchestration, and peace treaties sometimes failed without apparent reason. The covenant had evolved into a system capable of shaping history at a continental scale, blending ritual, psychological conditioning, and strategic influence into a seamless, reactive force. Historical evidence suggests that monarchs' awareness of this invisible guidance was acute. Diaries, letters, and marginal notes reveal rulers who approached every political or diplomatic decision with extreme caution, constantly weighing the unseen consequences of potential defiance or misalignment. Even minor acts, granting favor to an advisor, altering the wording of a treaty, or rearranging ceremonial seating, could provoke results that seemed improbable but aligned perfectly with the covenant's expectations. Monarchs internalized this system, cultivating intuition, perception, and a constant state of vigilance that made obedience second nature. Twist. Some scholars argue that the covenant acted almost like an invisible strategist, predicting and responding to human behavior with uncanny precision. Defiant actions were countered with mysterious setbacks, sudden illnesses, accidents, or political reversals, while compliance was rewarded with stability, prosperity, and influence. Monarchs who failed to recognize these subtle cues risked not only their reign, but the survival of entire dynasties. The covenant was no longer simply a ritualistic obligation. It had become an active, adaptive force guiding the trajectory of history itself. Advisors and courtiers became increasingly crucial in this stage. Those who mastered the covenant's hidden mechanisms were able to exert influence far beyond their official rank. By interpreting signals, orchestrating events, and guiding rulers' decisions, they could subtly shape policy, alliances, and even military campaigns. Monarchs, while outwardly sovereign, operated within a tightly controlled network of psychological and ceremonial influence that constrained freedom and directed outcomes with invisible precision. The Blood Pact had created a hidden architecture of power, blending authority, obedience, and subtle manipulation into a system that few could fully comprehend. The emotional burden on rulers remained immense. Chronic vigilance, constant calculation, and the pressure of centuries-old obligations created a psychological environment of tension, anxiety, and heightened awareness. Letters and diaries describe monarchs wrestling with self-doubt, isolation, and the ever-present fear that a single misstep could provoke repercussions beyond their control. Even intimate relationships, alliances with advisors, marriages, and familial interactions were conducted under the weight of invisible oversight, producing a court culture dominated as much by fear and loyalty as by strategy or affection. Twist. Monarchs occasionally tested the covenant's limits, seeking subtle avenues of defiance or independent action. Historical accounts indicate that these experiments often triggered immediate and unexplained consequences, political failures, sudden deaths, or accidents that reinforced the covenant's authority. These incidents suggest that the Blood Pact had evolved into a reactive, almost sentient force, capable of guiding behavior and shaping events with precision that blurred the lines between coincidence and design. Cultural influence was a key component of the covenant's pervasive control. Ceremonies, festivals, and public performances carried encoded instructions and warnings, ensuring that loyalty and compliance were continually reinforced. Music, art, literature, and even architecture became instruments of influence, transmitting subtle messages across generations. Monarchs and their courts learned to interpret these cues intuitively, understanding that perception itself could carry consequences, and that mastery of culture was as vital as political skill in navigating the covenant's hidden expectations. Generational continuity remained meticulously enforced. Heirs observed the behavior of predecessors, internalized lessons of compliance, and were trained to recognize subtle signals embedded in ritual, architecture, and culture. By the time they assumed power, they were psychologically conditioned to operate within the covenant's invisible framework, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and ensuring that the blood pact's influence persisted across centuries. The covenant had become a living, evolving system that shaped rulers before they ever ascended to the throne, ensuring continuity of power and obedience. Twist. Some heirs attempted to subvert or evade the covenant's subtle control, experimenting with clandestine negotiations, deviations in ritual, or private alliances. Historical records indicate that these acts were often met with rapid and mysterious consequences: illness, political reversals, or sudden misfortune, reinforcing the system's authority. The Blood Pact had become adaptive, reactive, and omnipresent, ensuring that even subtle acts of defiance were met with consequences that left rulers both wary and awed. The social and emotional dynamics of court life were defined by the covenant's invisible influence. Trust was constantly tested, alliances were carefully managed, and fear became an intrinsic element of interpersonal relationships. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and courtiers lived under the constant awareness that each decision, conversation, and gesture could carry unforeseen consequences. Obedience was instinctual, cultivated through generations of psychological conditioning, ritual reinforcement, and subtle environmental cues. The Blood Pact had created a court culture dominated as much by fear and reverence as by political strategy. Twist. Even today, subtle historical patterns hint at the covenant's lingering power. Unexplained reversals, sudden deaths, and improbable successes suggest the influence of a system that combines secrecy, ritual, psychological discipline, and strategic oversight. The Blood Pact had evolved into a force capable of shaping not only individual rulers, but entire nations, guiding alliances, conflicts, and dynastic trajectories with invisible precision. By this stage, the Blood Pact had become inseparable from European history itself. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and courts were enmeshed in a system that guided decisions, enforced loyalty, and subtly orchestrated outcomes. Its influence extended across generations, nations, and cultural expressions, blending ritual, psychological conditioning, and strategic manipulation into a force that was omnipresent yet invisible. Monarchs were powerful, yet constrained, influential, yet bound by obligations that transcended personal will. The Blood Pact had become a silent architect of history, orchestrating the destinies of rulers, dynasties, and kingdoms with subtle, unyielding authority. As the Blood Pact matured, its subtle influence began to infiltrate not just the political and cultural spheres of European monarchies, but also the private, intimate lives of rulers. Every decision, gesture, and relationship was subjected to its invisible logic. Diaries, letters, and personal accounts from this period reveal monarchs perpetually vigilant, analyzing even seemingly trivial actions for alignment with the covenant's centuries-old expectations. The psychological weight of this omnipresent authority created a tense environment where fear, loyalty, and self-preservation were inseparable from every aspect of daily life. The covenant shaped marriages, friendships, and family dynamics. Royal unions were rarely motivated solely by love, ambition, or political expedience. They were tools to reinforce compliance and loyalty, carefully calibrated to strengthen networks of influence. Even the most intimate relationships were influenced by unseen forces. Spouses, children, and close confidants became both participants in and instruments of the covenant, reinforcing its authority while perpetuating the emotional and psychological constraints that governed royal behavior. Monarchs could not simply act on personal desire. Every choice carried weight beyond their understanding, reflecting obligations that transcended time and lineage. Twist. Some monarchs attempted to subtly resist these constraints, engaging in secretive personal relationships or clandestine acts of rebellion. Historical records indicate that these deviations often coincided with sudden misfortunes, unexpected deaths, political failures, or unforeseen obstacles. Such events seemed inexplicable but reinforced the perception that the Blood Pact was not passive. It was reactive, adaptive, and capable of shaping events with uncanny precision. The Covenant had evolved into a living force, influencing not only governance and diplomacy, but the private hearts and minds of those it bound. Advisors and courtiers played a pivotal role in maintaining this delicate balance. They monitored behavior, interpreted subtle signals, and guided rulers in alignment with the Covenant's invisible logic. Their influence often surpassed that of the monarchs themselves, shaping decisions through quiet observation and careful manipulation. Monarchs, though outwardly sovereign, operated within a web of psychological and ceremonial enforcement that constrained autonomy while reinforcing loyalty. The Covenant's influence was total, yet largely imperceptible, blending ritual, culture, and personal psychology into a system of near-absolute control. The psychological and emotional burden was profound. Monarchs lived in a constant state of heightened vigilance, aware that even minor lapses could provoke consequences beyond immediate comprehension. Anxiety, doubt, and fear became intrinsic to leadership, shaping not only public behavior but private thought. Monarchs developed extraordinary psychological acuity, anticipating hidden forces and internalizing the Covenant's demands, yet the cost was often isolation, paranoia, and emotional exhaustion. Even the closest relationships were tinged with suspicion and caution, as loyalty was continually measured against invisible standards. Twist. In certain cases, monarchs' attempts to subtly test or circumvent the Covenant resulted in strikingly direct interventions. A miscalculated negotiation, a secret correspondence, or a minor deviation from ritual could provoke unexpected reversals in alliances, sudden deaths of key figures, or abrupt changes in fortune. These events, often interpreted as coincidence at the time, now suggest the Covenant's extraordinary precision, enforcing compliance and subtly orchestrating outcomes across generations. The Blood Pact had evolved into a reactive system, capable of shaping history through psychological, ceremonial, and even social channels. Culture and public ceremony were vital instruments of enforcement. Festivals, artistic performances, and public displays of loyalty reinforced the Covenant's authority, embedding its expectations into the social and emotional fabric of royal life. Monarchs and courtiers learned to read subtle cues. The positioning of participants, symbolic gestures, and the content of music or poetry could all communicate obedience or signal defiance. Failure to interpret these cultural messages correctly could provoke subtle yet immediate repercussions, further binding rulers to the invisible authority of the Blood Pact. Generational continuity remained essential to the Covenant's enduring power. Heirs observed their predecessors' behavior, absorbed lessons of loyalty and fear, and were educated to recognize the nuanced signals embedded in ritual, culture, and private life. From early childhood, they were conditioned to internalize the covenant's logic, ensuring that compliance became instinctive and rebellion almost inconceivable. By the time they assumed power, heirs were fully enmeshed within a system that extended influence across time, shaping not only individual lives, but the trajectory of entire dynasties. Twist. Some heirs attempted to challenge the covenant through subtle defiance, secret negotiations, unauthorized alliances, or private deviations from ritual. These experiments were almost invariably met with sudden and inexplicable consequences: illnesses, political reversals, or unexpected misfortunes that reinforced obedience. The blood pact was adaptive, reactive, and omnipresent, demonstrating that even carefully concealed acts of rebellion could not escape its influence. Its power transcended time, space, and even personal intention, enforcing continuity across generations with terrifying precision. The covenant's influence permeated social dynamics within a court. Trust was fragile, alliances were carefully maintained, and loyalty was continually tested. Fear, reverence, and psychological conditioning became inseparable from the fabric of relationships. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and courtiers operated in a complex ecosystem where obedience was internalized, instinctive, and continuously reinforced. The covenant shaped not only decisions and outcomes, but the very psychology and emotional life of those it bound. Twist. Even centuries later, historians can trace patterns suggestive of the covenant's enduring influence. Unexplained reversals, improbable coincidences, and sudden misfortunes indicate a system that combines secrecy, ritual, psychological conditioning, and subtle manipulation. The blood pact had evolved into a force capable of shaping not only the lives of individual rulers, but the destinies of nations, dynasties, and entire regions, orchestrating events with precision invisible to contemporary observers. By this point, the blood pact had become inseparable from European history itself. Its reach extended across generations, nations, and private lives, blending ritual, psychological conditioning, cultural expression, and strategic manipulation into a force that was omnipresent yet invisible. Monarchs were powerful, yet constrained, influential, yet bound by obligations that transcended personal will. The covenant had become a silent architect of history, orchestrating the destinies of rulers, dynasties, and kingdoms with subtle, unyielding authority. As the blood pact approached the final centuries of its known influence, its presence became increasingly woven into the very identity of European monarchies. It was no longer just a hidden system of control. It had become an invisible DNA of rulership, shaping political, cultural, and personal life with imperceptible yet undeniable force. Monarchs internalized its rules, rituals, and expectations so completely that their actions, decisions, and even emotions seemed predetermined by the covenant's centuries-old logic. To disobey was unthinkable. Yet the weight of such obedience carried profound psychological and emotional consequences. The covenant's subtle orchestration extended to international relations, where alliances, marriages, and diplomatic maneuvers were guided by hidden imperatives rather than mere strategy. Treaties that appeared to fail inexplicably, military campaigns that faltered without clear cause, or sudden reversals in fortune were often tied to the covenant's intricate enforcement mechanisms. Monarchs and advisors alike began to recognize the invisible hand guiding events, learning to anticipate consequences not through reason alone, but through intuition honed over decades of observing patterns, rituals, and subtle signs. Twist. Certain key figures within royal courts seemed to act almost as agents of the covenant, leveraging its hidden rules to exercise influence far beyond their formal authority. These individuals, advisors, architects of ritual, and even trusted family members, could manipulate outcomes through knowledge of the covenant's expectations, subtle signaling, and strategic intervention. Monarchs, though outwardly in command, often found themselves navigating a complex network of hidden influence, where the most powerful decisions were shaped as much by invisible enforcement as by personal ambition or political strategy. The emotional and psychological toll on rulers remained profound. Chronic anxiety, hypervigilance, and acute awareness of potential consequences became the norm. Monarchs lived in constant tension between desire, duty, and fear of defiance, their personal relationships and intimate connections often subject to the covenant's unseen control. Even the most private thoughts were constrained, as centuries of conditioning and ritualized observation taught rulers that deviation could provoke unforeseen setbacks or disasters. The covenant had become an omnipresent psychological force, as commanding as it was invisible. Twist. Attempts at defiance or deviation from the covenant were met with rapid and often mysterious consequences. Sudden deaths, political reversals, and unexpected misfortunes reinforced the perception that the covenant was reactive, adaptive, and capable of influencing outcomes with almost supernatural precision. Monarchs quickly learned that survival, prosperity, and influence depended on careful interpretation of subtle cues, alignment with ritual obligations, and absolute respect for the covenant's invisible authority. Even minor acts of rebellion could have outsized repercussions. Cultural expression became a primary channel for the covenant's subtle reinforcement. Architecture, paintings, literature, music, and ceremonial performance carried encoded signals of loyalty, compliance, and expectation. Monarchs were trained to recognize and respond to these cues, while advisors and courtiers subtly enforced them, ensuring that the covenant's influence extended into the everyday perception and behavior of rulers. Public and private life alike became a theater in which obedience was continually observed, evaluated, and reinforced, weaving the covenant into the very fabric of royal existence. Generational continuity was meticulously enforced. Heirs were educated not only in governance, but in interpreting the covenant's invisible signals, understanding the subtle architecture of power, and internalizing the lessons of fear, loyalty, and compliance. From early childhood, they were immersed in rituals, cultural cues, and psychological training designed to ensure seamless integration into the covenant system. By the time they assumed power, heirs were conditioned to operate instinctively within its framework, reducing the likelihood of rebellion and guaranteeing that centuries-old obligations persisted unchanged. Twist. Some heirs attempted subtle forms of defiance. Unauthorized alliances, secret negotiations, or deviations from ritual. But historical accounts indicate that these acts were swiftly countered by events that seemed coincidental yet were clearly aligned with the covenant's logic. Sudden illnesses, political setbacks, or unexpected misfortunes. The Blood Pact had become a reactive, adaptive system, ensuring that even carefully concealed rebellion could not escape its influence. Its power was both omnipresent and invisible, guiding behavior and shaping history with precision beyond human comprehension. Social and emotional dynamics within royal courts were inseparable from the covenant's influence. Trust was fragile, alliances carefully calibrated, and loyalty continually tested. Monarchs, heirs, advisors, and courtiers operated in a complex ecosystem where obedience was instinctive, fear was constant, and perception was as powerful as action. The covenant shaped every layer of interaction, from ceremonial gestures to private conversations, producing a court culture defined by subtlety, discipline, and psychological acumen. Twist. Even in hindsight, historians detect patterns that suggest the covenant's persistent influence. Sudden reversals, improbable coincidences, and repeated misfortunes hint at a system that combined ritual, psychological conditioning, and strategic orchestration. The Blood Pact was no longer merely a historical artifact. It was a force capable of guiding the destinies of rulers, dynasties, and entire nations with invisible, unerring precision. By this stage, the Blood Pact was inseparable from European history itself. Its influence extended across generations, nations, and personal lives, blending ritual, psychological conditioning, cultural expression, and strategic manipulation into a force both omnipresent and invisible. Monarchs were simultaneously powerful and constrained, their authority tempered by centuries-old obligations that transcended personal will. Advisors, heirs, courtiers, and cultural mechanisms acted as instruments of enforcement, ensuring compliance while perpetuating fear, loyalty, and subtle influence. The covenant had become the silent architect of history, orchestrating the destinies of rulers, dynasties, and kingdoms with precision and unyielding authority. As we reach the culmination of centuries of secrecy, ritual, and subtle orchestration, the true power of the Blood Pact becomes unmistakable. What began as a clandestine agreement, whispered and inked in secrecy, evolved into a force capable of shaping not only individual monarchs, but the destiny of entire nations. Across generations, the covenant silently dictated actions, enforced loyalty, and punished deviation with precision that seemed almost supernatural. Its influence was omnipresent yet invisible, operating through psychology, ritual, culture, and architecture, ensuring that rulers, heirs, and advisors alike were bound by obligations far older than themselves. The emotional toll of living under such invisible authority was profound. Monarchs navigated a world of constant vigilance, where even a minor misstep, a gesture, a word, or a personal choice could trigger unexpected reversals, accidents, or setbacks. Fear became inseparable from power, and obedience, whether willing or instinctual, became the currency of survival. Personal ambition, political maneuvering, and even intimate relationships were filtered through the lens of the covenant, creating a court culture dominated as much by psychological discipline and reverence as by authority or strategy. The Blood Pact's reach extended beyond law, tradition, and even conscience. It was a force that demanded recognition, respect, and submission. Twist. Some monarchs, in rare acts of defiance, sought to subvert or circumvent the covenant, experimenting with clandestine alliances, private negotiations, or minor breaches of ritual. Historical records hint at the consequences: sudden illnesses, accidents, political reversals, and even the mysterious downfall of entire dynasties. These incidents reveal that the Blood Pact was not passive. It was adaptive, reactive, and extraordinarily precise. Even subtle attempts to evade its influence could trigger events that reinforced its authority, demonstrating that compliance was not merely expected. It was essential for survival and the continuity of legacy. Advisors and courtiers, long enmeshed in the covenant's hidden logic, had become its indispensable agents. They interpreted cryptic cues, orchestrated ceremonial and social events, and guided monarchs through the complex web of obligations, ensuring that every decision aligned with centuries-old expectations. In many ways, they were the covenant's hands and eyes, translating invisible power into actionable guidance. Monarchs, though outwardly sovereign, often relied on these individuals to navigate a reality that combined psychological pressure, ritualistic control, and historical precedent into an almost inescapable framework. The Blood Pact's influence extended beyond personal behavior into broader historical outcomes. Wars, treaties, alliances, and political marriages were subtly guided by invisible imperatives, often leading to results that historians struggle to explain. Seemingly coincidental successes or failures were in fact aligned with the Covenant's logic, demonstrating that history itself had been shaped by forces beyond immediate comprehension. Monarchs and heirs internalized this truth, cultivating intuition, perception, and caution, recognizing that their decisions were observed not only by advisors, but by a centuries-old covenant whose reach extended far beyond their own lifetimes. Twist. Even the architectural and cultural environments of royalty reinforced the covenant's control. Palaces, halls, and private chambers were designed with symbolic intent, subtly guiding movement, behavior, and decision-making. Art, music, and literature carried encoded messages, reinforcing loyalty and signaling consequences for deviation. Every gesture, every choice, every public appearance was filtered through a system that intertwined environment, culture, and ritual into a cohesive mechanism of influence. Monarchs became both participants in and instruments of this invisible orchestration, their lives bound by a force that was simultaneously omnipresent and imperceptible. The emotional resonance of this history is profound. The Blood Pact was not merely a system of control. It was a psychological and emotional architecture that shaped human behavior across generations. It created rulers who were powerful yet constrained, influential yet conditioned, ambitious yet bound by obligations that spanned centuries. Fear, reverence, and loyalty became intertwined with identity, producing a legacy of rulers whose very thoughts and actions were molded by forces older than themselves. The Covenant left an indelible mark not only on history, but on the human experience of power, trust, and obedience. Twist. In rare glimpses, we see that the Covenant's influence may persist even today, subtly embedded in traditions, cultural expectations, and the hidden architecture of modern monarchy and governance. Patterns of continuity, unexplained reversals, and recurring coincidences hint at a system that transcends time, one that has shaped not only historical outcomes, but the emotional and psychological framework through which power is exercised. The Blood Pact's shadow stretches far beyond its apparent historical period, leaving an enduring testament to the extraordinary potential of secrecy, ritual, and generational obligation. The final reflection is haunting yet awe-inspiring. The Blood Pact demonstrates that history is not shaped solely by visible forces, battles, or decrees. It is also influenced by invisible, subtle systems that guide behavior, enforce loyalty, and shape destiny with precision. Monarchs were not merely historical figures. They were actors in a centuries-old theater of obedience and psychological orchestration, where survival and legacy depended on understanding forces beyond immediate perception. The Covenant exemplifies the extraordinary power of secrecy and the human capacity to internalize obligations that span lifetimes. As we consider the legacy of the Blood Pact, we are left with a question that lingers beyond the pages of history. What if the forces that shaped empires, wars, and dynasties were not always visible or rational, but instead rooted in centuries of secret ritual, psychological conditioning, and unyielding obligation? How might our understanding of history and the human capacity for power, loyalty, and fear change if we recognize the invisible hands that have guided events across generations. The covenant challenges our assumptions, revealing a hidden architecture of authority that shaped rulers, nations, and the course of European history in ways still difficult to fully comprehend. Twist. The ultimate revelation is that the Blood Pact was never just about power. It was about continuity, control, and the subtle shaping of human destiny. It demonstrates that the true forces guiding history are often unseen, operating in shadows, in whispers, and in invisible patterns that extend across generations. Monarchs, heirs, and advisors were not simply participants in historical events. They were instruments of a covenant that demanded loyalty, orchestrated obedience, and shaped outcomes with unerring precision. The past, in this light, becomes a theater of invisible influence, where human emotion, ambition, and fear were molded by forces older and deeper than any crown or throne. In the end, the Blood Pact leaves us with a profound reflection. History is more than dates, battles, and rulers. It is a tapestry woven with secrecy, ritual, and unseen obligation. It reminds us that power is as much psychological and emotional as it is political, and that obedience and fear can shape destinies across centuries. As we look back, we are left to ponder, what if the hidden hands of history still guide us, subtly shaping decisions, loyalties, and outcomes in ways we cannot perceive? The legacy of the covenant endures, not as myth, but as a testament to the extraordinary, invisible forces that have quietly steered human destiny for generations.